Welcome to Learning React Data Visualization. My name is Ben Falla and this is a Pact Publishing production. In this title, we're going to be doing a lot, but before we explore the main topics, let's focus on who you are and who this title is for really. So you're a JavaScript developer, not necessarily up to date with the latest technologies because we're going to update you, but assuming that you're already a JavaScript developer. Secondary, you're comfortable with terminal. You have basic comfort with it, which means you know how to install applications on terminal and how to work with the basics. We're not going to explore the basics of terminal. And we assume that as you start this title, you know what it is, you know how to work with it, and you're a JavaScript developer. So what are we going to explore in this title? And our learning goals are very diverse, starting from data itself, and we're going to look at how to work with a lot of different types of data. We're going to see how to work with JSON, web services, CSV, and even MongoDB. Those are the types of data. So we're going to see a NoSQL type of database. We're going to look at files. We're going to look at converting data to fit our needs. And the secondary learning goal is seeing how do you take that data and make it visual, and to do that we're going to have an interactive map, we're going to have a grid, we're going to have a chart or a graph, and a few different types of charts and graphs in the process. Now our secondary learning goal will be also to explore React.js, JSX, and ES6 to get you up to speed and learn how to work with them. With that said, we'll also explore other technologies such as Node.js, Express.js, and MongoDB, but they're not going to be the main focus of throughout the title. So let's jump right into our first chapter, because our first chapter is dedicated to JSON, where we're going to learn about the JSON foundations, and we're going to learn how to import JSON files into our project, and also how to build ES6 React components that integrate JSON into them. So let's jump right into this chapter, starting with the first lecture that we'll use to set things up and show you our development environment. Through it, we're going to explore Babel and show you that you could use already today ES6 and JSX, because it's going to automatically be converted with the help of Babel and Webpack and our Webpack dev server, so we could have a running server live as we're working that is automatically sending to our browser a downgraded version of JavaScript, even though we're working with the latest cutting edge JSX and ES6. Last but not least, also we're going to use Webpack dev server to create hot refreshes, which will basically cut down a lot of our refreshes, because we don't have to click on refresh anymore. It will automatically recompile and refresh our code every time we make a change. So let's see it in action. Now, to be able to take full advantage of this course, you really need to have NPM and Node.js installed on your system. If you're not sure if you have Node.js or NPM, go into your terminal and type node-v. If you type node-v and you see a version number, that means you have Node.js installed and you're already in really good shape. We're going to be running on version 6.3 for this title, but make sure you grab the latest version, whatever it is. Last but not least, make sure that you have NPM installed as well by typing npm-v. If any of the two doesn't install or doesn't come through, or if at any stage when we're doing something you're getting an error, a permissions error, make sure that you go into the document that is provided, the link that is provided with more information on how to install Node.js and NPM onto your system. From here on, we're assuming that you have both of them set up and configured. And it's time for us to talk about the source files. In the download folder that you're going to have with this course, you're going to find many folders with source files. Among them, you'll have the 00.starter files, where you'll find the starting files that are appropriate for most of the chapters. If a certain chapter needs a different starter file, you'll find it appended with the actual chapter number with the word starter file. In the case of, for example, the first chapter, which we're just about to get into, we're going to be starting from that starter file. So when you're looking into this file, these are the outcomes of the work that we've done, starting from the files that were within the starter file. With that said, let's take a look at the basic structure of the files that you're going to expect inside of that starter file. And first of all, you're going to find a public folder where in it you'll have a very empty HTML file with literally almost nothing inside of it besides a div and an ID for our React application. In our root folder, you're going to find a package.json and a webpack.config.js. In the source file, you're going to find our client.js that currently has a very basic JavaScript just for testing purposes. Now, I want to talk a little bit about package.json, and although this title is not going to go deeply into this topic, and if you want to learn more about how NPM works and how Node.js works in general, I urge you to check my title, Full Stack React. Just search within the platform you're on for Full Stack React, where you'll get a very good bird's view over React and a lot of other technologies that are very critical for working in React. Now, I want to talk about the things that are inside of here, even though we're not going to manually install them. First of all, our application has a few dependencies, and among them, the most important one is React and React DOM, which are used for every single React application that we're building. Babel Polyfill is going to make sure that browsers that don't fully support ES5 will have that extended fills, those shims or polyfills that will make sure that older browsers that don't fully support ES5 will have support as well. In our dev dependencies, these are dependencies that we're going to be used to build up our final files, which will then be hosted. So these are pre-hosting files and pre-hosting elements that will help us in our work. Among them, we'll have a few Babel packages that will enable us to start coding already now in ES6 and with JSX in React, while our actual outcome application is going to actually run in ES5, even though we're developing in ES6. Webpack and Webpack Dev Server are going to help us streamline and speed up the process of preparing and outputting our file to create a hotfix that will enable us to basically not need to recompile things, but every time we make an update, our browser will refresh with that content that we've just updated. Last but not least, our webpack.config.js file has all the description and the information and the settings both for our development server and also for how is it going to use Babel, what is it going to compile. So in this case, it's searching for our JavaScript file in our source file called client.js, and it's going to output that file as index.js in our root path. In other words, our output will be our local host server in port 3000, and if we want to gain access to the JavaScript that is being compiled, we're going to want to add that into our HTML file so we'll have access to it. Last but not least, the files as you're getting them does not contain actually the Node.js files that are needed for our application to run. And every single source file that you're going to be working with, before you could actually start working with it, make sure that you type inside of that folder npm install. When you do that, it's going to go through the process of going through the documentation that are in this JSON package, and it's going to go through and install the dependencies and the dev dependencies. In the next lecture, we're going to be under the assumption that you've installed all those packages and you're ready to start developing and working in our environment. In this lecture, we saw our setup that we'll be using throughout our title. In the next lesson, we'll start moving into coding itself as we explore and take an overview of JSON basics. If you're not up to speed with JSON, fear not, because this lecture will speed you through it, because it's really very similar to JavaScript because it's derived out of JavaScript, but it's an independent setup. Now, basically, the way you would create objects is the way you would create also JSON, only with a few slight exceptions, and we're going to explore them and look at how they work. Now, some implementations of JSON are more strict than others. So, for example, MongoDB, which we'll explore in the last section, which uses JSON as well, is a lot more flexible than a lot of other parsers that are run on a browser or run on the server itself. So we're going to show you the strict configurations of how to set it up, and then if you ever have an error when you're running JSONs, and a high probability is because you didn't adhere directly to the configurations that we're going to talk about in this lecture. So let's jump right into it. Again, assuming you have NPM and Node.js installed, our next step before we start talking about JSON is to get our server running. Now, because I already pre-configured our server settings in my package.json, I've made sure that Webpack and Webpack Dev Server are installed. And as well, I've added a script here which is called start, that will enable me very easily to start up our server. When we start up our server, and let me just go ahead and do that. If I go into my terminal, I'm just going to type npm start. By doing that, it's going to start up my server, and my server will be running on the local host. Now, all that's left for me to do to see that it's running is to go on to my browser and click on refresh, and we should see mastering React data visualization. I want you to note, and deliberately I didn't set up our JavaScript file to run. You see that right now that starter file is working, is not running. And that is because I need to go into my index.html and also add that file. Now that file is not going to be called client.js, and that is because in my webpack I'm using that entry point of that client and converting it into a bundled version of all the JavaScript files that will be included in this or used by this file into the file index.js. So all I really need to do to gain access to it is literally just go and type index.js in the browser to see that file, which actually renders out with all the extra things it needs to be able to run ES6 on any browser. ES5, sorry, in any browser, because it's converting from ES6 to ES5, and also adding shims to make sure that things are working, adding in all the things that are used. Now, for us to actually take advantage of it, we need to add it into our HTML. So go right to the bottom of your file and add a new script tag, and we don't need type because it's the default type, which is JavaScript, but make sure that we're referencing to index.js. And I'll make sure that it's also in the starter file, so in the future you won't need to do it, but make sure that you're aware that this is needed for it actually to work. With that said, if you go back into your browser, it should usually refresh, but because we didn't add any JavaScript into the file, then it's not refreshing automatically. But if I click here refresh one more time, you'll see that our starter file is working. Moreover than that, if I go back into that starter file and change it from starter file is working to and save that change, you'll see that also our browser will refresh its content and update that as well. With that said, before we wrap up this conversation, I want to also talk about JSON in general. Although you're JavaScript developers, so you should be familiar with the basic construct of JSON, JSON in general is an object. And it has an object structure with a few different rules where the name can't be a name directly, although it does work in JavaScript for the most. You want to bound it in a string, and then you set the value. Now the value could be or a string, the value could be or a number. The value could also be a Boolean value. A value could be also an array. And so on and so forth. Last but not least, you could also add objects inside of it. So I could have another object, for example, let's say eyes. And eyes could have here an object, and that object could have here left, and my left eye is green, and let's say that my right eye brown. In a nutshell, this is JSON. Now, the next question is, how do you get it to be in a separate file, which is something that we're going to cover in the next lecture. But as this is quite a simple construct for someone that is working in JavaScript, I'm going to go ahead and delete it. The most important thing, again, is just making sure that you're using the legal object notations. We're not using any modern variations or any fancy JavaScript things. It's really just the basics of the basics. A string from one side, a string on the other. Although on the other side, it can be or a string, a number, a Boolean value, an array, or even an object. And that is the construct of a JSON file. In this lecture, we explored JSON and saw how it works, including its specification. It's time for us to go into building something, and we're going to take a look at how do we import JSON files with Webpack. A big part of ES6 is modular building, which enables us to put our code in a lot of different files and then bundle them up together. Unfortunately, JSON is not supported built into ES6, and for that, we're going to use Webpack and our Webpack dev server to add into it a loader, and that loader is going to be the JSON loader. Now, what's that is going to do is it's going to expand the ES6 features to enable us to load in JSON files as we're compiling our application if we need data to be in our application as soon as it's loaded. So let's see it in action, and let's see how to load up JSON file with the help of Webpack. If we weren't working with Webpack, we could have just natively used some Node.js capabilities of loading in native JSON data using require. But as our focus is on React, we really want to use Webpack, and beyond that, we really want to use only ES6 standards. So with that said, let me show you how to get that running. And the first step I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my source folder and create a new file. I'm just going to call this data.json. And as we know how to create JSON files, I'm just going to go ahead and delete the content and grab our object from within, leaving out that semicolon because it's just not needed or wanted or warranted in a JSON app. Now, I'm going to go ahead and save this. Now, before we could actually run our object, I'm going to have to do here a few changes. So first of all, I'm going to delete this object altogether. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to terminate our terminal, our server, by clicking on Command C, or actually Control C, and I'm going to exit, because what I want to do is I want to go my npm install, and I want to install into my dev environment. So I'm going to add --save-dev, and I'm going to load up also JSON loader. Now, JSON loader is an add-on that enables me to add customizations to the way Webpack works, which it packages up my website. So I want to go to Webpack itself while it's installing into the Webpack config, and I'll just show you in the meantime that just as we have here in our loaders, one of the loaders is the Babel loader, which manages the transcribing from ES6 to ES5. I want to go ahead and add another loader, only this loader is going to be in charge of loading in JSON files. Now, to do that, I'm going to go ahead and add a test, and this test is literally going to be a regex that tests out to see, and this regex, let me just copy it, is going to be very similar to any file that is a .js file, only instead we're going to ask for any .json file, making sure that anything that is a .json file will go through the specific loader that we're going to account for here, which in our case, it is called JSON. Now, JSON for JSON loader and Babel for Babel loader. I could have typed here also JSON dash loader. By the way, I could have not put that dash loader as well. But what I'm literally doing here is I'm saying to Webpack, as it's packaging files, if it sees something that ends with .json, take over. Take over and you continue the implementation. Now I could go inside of my client.js, and in my code here, instead of creating a var file, I'm going to use an ES6 standard. And this ES6 standard is called import, and I'm going to list out what do I want to import. In this case, I'm going to call this data, and I'm going to import it from our folder, current folder, into our data.json. Now, because we had that Webpack, it's going to notice that it's a JSON, and it's going to wrap up and do what it needs to and pass that information into the data folder. Now, to test this out and see that it works, I'm going to go ahead here and ask for data. Let's go for name, just so we will have my name on the document. Last but not least, let me go save this, and I'm just going to show you that as we installed this new package, you'll find it now inside of our JSON loader is going to be one of those web dependencies. With that said, let's go ahead into our start up our server. So let me just clear the screen. npm start. As we start up our server and it is running, if I go back into my browser, we'll see that my name is Ben, and it sure is. Now, this, by the way, is not a standard in ES6 because ES6 does not support importation of JSON files. You could use different libraries and loaders, but it's not built into the package, although the support itself for JSON is built into JavaScript in general. But the loading of a JSON, external JSON file using import is not a standard, and we're actually using this workaround through Webpack to enable us to use it using that loader, making sure that it recognizes that it's inside of the client, it recognizes it's a JSON file, and then it fills the data object up with the data that's inside of data.json. Now, there are ways to create this type of structure, but we wouldn't just put your code. When using import, there is a standard to export things, which we'll talk about in a future lecture. But for now, this solved our problem for needing to load up our JSON file. In this lecture, we saw how to use the Webpack dev server to load up our JSON file. In the next lecture, now that we have JSON data inside of our application, it's time for us to build out an ES6 React component. Our data is ready and imported, and it's time for us to move into our main topic, which is React. And we're going to build out an ES6 React component, or an ES6 class, which is a component. In the process, we're going to look at how to work with ES6 in general. We're going to export that class, and we're also going to import it into our client, looking through the whole process of the creation of a class through exporting and importing it. So let's jump right into it. Alrighty, let's get some React into the picture. Now, one thing that I want to also note is that we're not going to do in this title a deep dive into what React is. There's a little bit of an assumption that you're familiar with it. If you want to really take a deep dive into the world of React, please look into my title, Mastering React Components, which is really focused purely on the fundamentals of React and creating with it wonderful components. Although we'll do the same in this title, our focus is not going to be on that as the process. Our focus will be on the data itself and how to visualize it. With that said, take a look inside of your package.json just as a reminder that we already installed React and React DOM as part of our core dependencies. Now, if you're going to be installing things on your own and haven't used our base file, make sure to get out of your web server that is running and then go ahead and call npm install and then -- save and then call for React and React DOM. In our case, we're not going to do that because we already have it installed, so we don't need to install it. So I'm going to go ahead and start up our server again. And as we have it already installed, I want to show you the basic constructs of how you work with React in ES6. So let's go ahead and do it, and I'm going to start off from going into my source folder, because what I want to do is I want to create a new directory, and I'm going to call that directory or folder components. Why am I calling it components? The reason is very simple, because React things are components. Everything you create in React is a component. And I want to put my components in a separated folder for components. Now, by the way, I'm not putting it in a folder called Components Client because React components could be used on the server, on React Native, and in many other places. And generally speaking, I want to create my React components to be reusable for the client and other environments. That is part of the logic why there is a library called React and a separate library called React DOM. Now, the reason is because React itself is in charge of that API to create your constructs, your components, while React DOM is in charge of getting it up into the DOM. This separation has a lot of logic, which we cover a lot of it in our Mastering React Components. But I just wanted to make sure that you see and understand that separation, because we'll be working, when we're working inside of the component folder, only with the React library, while when we're trying to render things, such inside of our client folder, we're also going to leverage the React DOM to tell React where should it render the things that it's creating. So with that said, let's go into our components folder and create our first component. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to call the file app.js. And let me just go ahead and save that. And now I have a new file. Beautiful. So let me just delete that, and let's start the process of creating a React component. Now, the first step that we're going to do, and the most important step, is that we need to go ahead and import the React library. We do that using the ES6 import directive, and I'm saying import from, and this time around, instead of putting a / for the current directory, I'm just going to type directly React. That's going to tell our Node.js and Webpack, for that matter, that we should find this library as one of the modules of Node.js, which surely React is one of those modules. We've even installed it, and we could see it inside, not here, inside of our package.json, we have the React package. So I'm going ahead and loading up that, or importing that library and placing it inside of the React access point or object. The next step is I'm going to go ahead and create a class in ES6. Now the way I do that is I type the word class, which is now a reserved word, then I type in a name to that class, and then I open a curly bracket and close a curly bracket. In my situation, I'm not only creating a class, I want to create a class that extends the React component base class. To do that, I'm going to type in extends and then type React.component, beautiful, React.component. What that will do is it's going to make sure that my app extends the features that are inside React.component. Last but not least, to create a very thin basic React component, I need to go ahead and create a rendering function. In ES6, all I need to do inside of a class is type the name of the function. In this case, we said it's called render, then open and close a round bracket, open a curly bracket, close a curly bracket. I do not need to use the word function, and that's all I need to do to create our method of the React component in our app that is called rendered. The next step that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put here a return value, because that's what the render method expects, and return here some construct. Now React expects the render method to return something that is or HTML or another component. Now a really cool feature that is the birth child of Facebook/React is JSX. Now, because we originally, when we were setting up our project in our package, made sure that we also included the React preset, it enables us to use JSX inside of our application. And inside of our app, I want to show you the basic construct of JSX. And that is literally, I could just put inside native HTML, hello world. Now, one of the basic core rules of JSX is whenever you're working with JSX, and by the way, this is automatically converted into JavaScript with the help of Webpack and Babel, but in our situation, what is actually happening, what's important for us to notice is that we have an opening tag, a closing tag. You cannot have a H1 and then a H2. It has to be bounded by one item. With that said, now that I have here a self-enclosed root or XML valid structure, let's go and integrate this app that we've just created into our client. So the next step for us to do is we're going to go ahead and auto import into this area React itself. The reason is because we're going to use JSX as well. And I'm going to go ahead and get that from React, and I'm going to import auto React DOM from React DOM. And let me just make sure that that's all uppercase, because the DOM is uppercase, really. Okay, now that we've loaded the two library packages that we need to actually render things out, let's go ahead and also import our component, which we decided to call app from. And this really moves us to that conversation that we were talking about. How do you actually load things up? So first of all, components, app.js or not.js, it automatically will know. But in our app itself right now, if I try to run anything at this point, it will not actually work, because in my application itself, I need to tell JavaScript what is going to be exported. And in this case, because we only have one class, we really want it to be exported. So I'm just going to type here export default, which basically tells the browser, or tells in our case Webpack, that this class is going to be the default class that is going to be imported. By the way, making the name really not that relevant, because inside of our client, whenever I'm importing it, it's going to grab that class and it's going to assign it to whatever name I set here. In my case, app works really well. The next step that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and delete this document change, because instead of that, I want to go ahead and use that React DOM object that we've loaded up, and I'm going to ask it to render. And what do I want to render? Here I'm going to put in another JSX, and literally what I'm going to do is I'm going to call my app itself. Last but not least, as the second parameter, this is like HTML, only instead of that we're using here, by the way, a very important differentiation is when I'm typing regular HTML, it's all lowercase. In any situation where I'm trying to load in a class, I have to put here in uppercase. That will tell the rendering engine JSX to search for a class and render that item out and actually send an object out here and not this XML. But this XML structure makes it really very intuitive, especially as you're building structured data. The next step, I'm going to go into my document.getElementById. And I'm going to tell React that I want it to load up into the React ID area, because I have here inside of my body a React div element with an ID of React. So again, let's walk through the steps. I made sure that I loaded React. Why did I load React? It's very simple. When this app is being rendered, it's converted into React.load component or somewhat. It actually turns it into React code, and it needs access to that React rendering tool to fetch that app component and build it out. That is happening behind the scenes, which we don't really need to worry about as long as we loaded up React. Our React DOM is going to help us communicate with the browser and tell it, hey, we want our application to be loaded up and put into this specific div. So in this case, we're getting that div and telling it, hey, this is the root directory for our rendering. Last but not least, we have here our data, which we'll take a look at in the next lecture, how we connect that data into our new app. But let's go ahead and save our application and check and see if we actually got our app to render out and show something. So first of all, we could see that React Create Element is not loading up correctly. And the reason is because in my app itself, once I've changed and set that export default, I didn't save it. So let me go ahead and save that, and let's go back into my application and click refresh, or well, it's going to happen automatically because we have Webpack, and you can see that we have your hello world. And with that, that is the basic construct that with it we create React components in ES6 with exporting and importing. In this lecture, we created an ES6 class, we exported it, and we also imported it. It's time for us to move into integrating the JSON into our component, and that's exactly what we'll do in the next lecture. Now that we have a React component, it's time for us to integrate our JSON data into that component. In the process, we're going to take a look at JSX and the JSX spread feature, which is new as well. We're going to take a look at how to integrate properties into React components, and we're going to integrate that JSON file. So let's jump right into it. Alright, let's continue down the path so far, and we're very close to wrapping up this section, but we really want to use the data that we're loading up from our JSON file. Let's just use name and age for now, and to do that I want to show you how do you send information into a component of React using JSX. The first step that I'm going to do is I'm going to define a property just like we would in HTML. Then I'll open and close a curly bracket, and inside of this section I'll go ahead and send in the information that I want to have sent to that component. Let me just word wrap, and let's go ahead and do the same thing also for our age, and I'll just open and close a round bracket and send that data.age into that region as well. Now, this is a JSX construct that enables us to inject into it some native JavaScript. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my app component and actually use the information that we've just sent. Now, in React, the way we do that is we use something that's called props. Those are properties that we're sending out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this return value, and instead of that I want to send out a more complex structure, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set here a div, making sure that I'm opening and closing that div. Now inside I'm going to send here an h1 just like we had before, and I'm also going to send a paragraph. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put here, let's say, my name. So again, open and close a curly bracket, and then put inside the native JavaScript code. In this case, I'm going to use the built-in this.props property that will give me access to the properties that have been sent to this app component. And in this case, I want to fetch the name, which is surprisingly my name. I could also integrate it, for example, he is at least years old, and I could go ahead and in that area just put again around a curly bracket and send and call in the props.age. If I go ahead and test this out in the browser, we should now see if we don't have an error. Boop. Let's see what's going on. All right, so let's give it another shot. So first of all, let me go ahead and save this. And I'm going to go into my client itself to check and see if I have here anything that stands out as something odd. But really, I don't see any problem. Oh, and I probably didn't save it earlier. So I went ahead and saved both files. And here we go, Ben, he is at least 33 years old. Beautiful. So that is how I send in properties. And I want to show you just one more thing that you could do in JSX before we wrap up this title. So far, I'm using only the name and the age, but maybe in reality, I want to use everything inside of this JSON object. The easiest way to do that is instead of using these properties, and let me just go ahead and remove them, and I'll leave them here for you so you'll be able to look at them. I'm going to open and close a curly bracket and then type ... and then the name of the object that I want to break up open and send into the React component. What will actually happen is a lot of variables such as name, age, smart, friends, eyes will be all sent into the app. And in this case, we could have here, for example, we could have here some sort of a logic set that we could have here. How about we'll have here some sort of a variable, and I'm going to set here is smart, and I'm going to set here if this.props.smart is true, he is smart will come out. If he isn't smart, I will have a he is not smart. And by the way, if you're not familiar with this construct, it's called ternary operator. And a ternary operator really is just you have your condition or a boolean and then a question mark. If the condition matches, then the first item will happen, and after that you have a colon, and the second would if it's the else. So it's kind of like a very condensed if else. Now that I have here this is smart, which is probably not correct, but this is going to be smart message as a variable, I could go ahead and just add that into my props here and set here a smart message as another property that is being sent through. And again, if the property smart is in existence, which it should be because we're sending it in and its value is true, then it should send us he is smart. And let's go ahead and save this. And let's go ahead and save our client also to make sure that we don't make the same mistake twice. And if I go ahead and automatically look at it, we'll see that he is smart. But if I go into my JSON and I change it to be false, and I go back in there, we'll see he is not smart. So there we go. That is how you build React components in ES6 and how you pass properties into them. In this section, we learned how to create JSON structures, we learned how to import them, and we've learned also how to create React components in ES6 and integrate into them JSON data. In this lecture, we saw how to integrate properties into React components, and by that saw how to use that JSON data that we've created throughout this chapter. The next chapter is going to be about a new data type and a new topic and a new visualization, where we're going to take a look at web services. Welcome back to a new section where we're going to explore web services and through them create an interactive map that even has a grid. So we're going to go ahead and create a map. We'll learn how to work with latitude and longitude and how to calculate them. We're going to explore some more ES6 code, connect our map to a web service, and then change the component state, learning more about React states as we integrate dynamic data that will be derived out of the user's interaction with that map. So with that said, let's jump right into this section and start with our first lecture where we're going to be creating a map using a fresh new React component. In the end of this lecture, we're going to have a React component that has a map within. Let's jump right into it. This is a friendly reminder that our starter file that we're going to be working with is, although we're in web services chapter, we're starting off with the same starter files that we've worked with previously. So with that said, let's jump right into our code, and all it really is a duplicate of our starter files. And I'm going to go ahead and into the editor, and we're going to start off by creating a new component. So I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call it components. And in our components folder, I'm going to go ahead and create a new file, and I'm going to call this file map.js and go ahead and save it. And all that's left for us to do is to build out our class. And again, the steps involved with it are, first of all, we're going to need to use the React library. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and import React from React. And again, just as a reminder, we already installed it, and make sure also that when you're running your source files, make sure that you're going to click and type in npm install so the node modules will be installed, or nothing will work. And you'll find inside of your package.json in our starter file that we have React and React DOM included as part of the dependencies that are being used. So back into our map, we've imported React. The next step that we want to do is we want to define a new class that we're going to be exporting. So I'm going to set it and say export default class and give it a name, followed by extends react.component. Okay, so that is the structure of our class. All that's really left for us to do is to go ahead and render something out, and I'm going to go ahead and do that right away by calling the render function. And I'm going to go ahead and return from that render JSX, an image, and it's just going to be a self-enclosed image. Now, before I wrap this baby up, I'm going to go ahead and copy paste here an image that I already selected. And by the way, it's in your appended resources as well. It's a image that belongs to the Commons legal whatnot, so you can't use it for commercial uses, but I'm taking it right from Wikipedia. What I'm going to go ahead and do is literally just load up that image. So once I've created the render function, let's go ahead into our client and configure the client as well, so we'll actually be able to see it. So again, I'm going to have to import, let me just copy that word so we don't have to do it over and over, and I'm going to import React from React. Next, I want to go ahead and import React DOM from React DOM. Last but not least, I want to also import our map, and I'm going to call it map, and I'm going to get it from our current directory, going into the components directory, asking for the map file, or class for this matter. And all that's left for us to do, and I'm going to go ahead and delete this, is to go ahead and actually render it out. And the way that we do that, we call the React DOM, and we call the render method, and we send as the first parameter what do we want to render. In this case, we want to render the map, and the next is where do we want to render it, and I want to render it in my document get element by ID, and our ID is called React. And if I go ahead and save this and go into my browser, I should be seeing now a map, and surely I do. In this lecture, we created a React component of a map. Now that we have the foundations ready, in the next lecture, we're going to go ahead and try to find the points that users click on a map and calculate those points. In the last lecture, we've created a map, but for us to make it interactive, we need to figure out where are the points the user is clicking on the map. In the process, we're also going to explore let, which is new to ES6, and we're going to talk about what it actually is and how it actually works. But I just want to also say, although we're not going to talk specifically about const, the same rules apply to const as they do to let, which we'll explore in this section. The only difference is when you define a variable instead of using var, and you're using const instead, it is a constant, which means once you set the value in, you cannot change it again, which is really, really good for debugging. But in this lecture, we'll take a look at let and how it works. We're going to debug things, and we're also going to look at how to work with events within React for us to get that points that we need for our map. All right, let's continue. So the real goal really is, if you take a look at this map, my goal is to be able to click on different regions and to be able to get the, I would say, cities or locations in our nearby, and we're going to use web services for that. But before we could do that, we need to figure out what the longitude and latitude is. So let's go ahead and start the process. So inside of my map itself, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my map, and what I want to do is I want to add to the map itself a click event. So let's go ahead and let's add here an on click, and I'm going to tell it that when it clicks, we want to call this dot on click, and obviously we would have to make sure that we create that method. So let's go ahead and create on click. And on click has an event, so I'm just going to put here an E for event. Beautiful. Now we're already in a really good shape, but what we want to do is we want to capture the actual XY positions that are, or the coordinates that our that our image is capturing. So to do that, I'm going to create a new let, and lets are just like variables. The only difference is that a let, contrary to a variable, which is new to ES6, lives within the bounds of, I would say, an enclosure. It's not in the bounds of an object. It's not in the bounds of a function. It's in the bounds of a object. So of a wrapping. So in other words, if I had here these open and closing curly brackets, and I set here a let, and let's say I called this name equals, or let's set it even to what we need it to be. For example, image. Now, in the case of image, our image is inside of our e.target. Now, what will happen is if I go to my console log and I log out that image right away in this spot, I'm going to get that image, even though we're sitting in supposedly an object, or it's an organizer for that. Say it's not really an object. For example, it could be here a case of an if statement. So if true, which will always happen, then I'm going to set up a variable and set its target and log out our image. Now, if we go into our browser, we'll see that, and if I open up our inspector console, I will see that I'm going to get basically, when I click on something, I'm going to get my image. Beautiful, exactly as we wanted it to be. But notice what's going to happen if I take that image out and I call it outside of that if statement. If I do that and I try to run it again, we're going to see that I'm not going to actually get that value. When I click on it, it's going to tell me that that image reference is not defined. And that is really useful, especially in situations where you're only using something on a block level. Generally speaking, I would say use let all the time, unless you need a variable because you need a scope that is larger from where you're at. But generally speaking, a let will definitely do. Okay, so now that we set our let and you know the difference between a let and a var, I want to go ahead and set our point. Now our point is really the x and y coordinates of our mouse, so I'm going to go ahead and use a new to CS3 type of property that is called offset x, and I'm going to set also our offset y. Now our offset x and our offset y should give us the values that are coming back from our x and y coordinates. Although the support is not fully integrated yet, and our React packages and our packages that basically included our polyfills don't really include that as far as I know. But even if they did, assuming, let's say this is something that is not supported yet, or we didn't have a shim for it and we didn't add that extra capability to make sure that this always works, I could just go ahead and ask literally if my point has an x point, so I know it has an x and a y. If it doesn't, I'll just go ahead and I'll update that point to use the old school way of doing it, which would be to ask for the page's x coordinate and subtract out of it the target dot offset left. And I would do the exact same thing for the y to get the basically to get the same thing. So I'm going to take my page y, which will give me the actual coordinate of our element within the page, and I'm going to subtract out of it the actual target's offset top, making sure that I'm actually getting the full point. So if I go ahead here and I save this and do here a little console.log for our point, we should be getting our point every time we click onto it to run it. So if I go ahead here and I try to click somewhere, we're going to see that, first of all, I'm getting undefined, which is already a bad thing. So let's see what's going on here. So first of all, let me go ahead and put here another console log just before to just get what is inside of my currently on the point even before we change it. Is it going to be changed? So let's go ahead and take a look. So if I click here, I'm getting first of all undefined and then I'm getting undefined again. Okay, so it's telling me that the value that I've put here, and let me just comment this whole thing out. Let's debug this out completely. So for point X, I'm not getting anything. So let's double check that I'm really not getting anything. And let me also double check for our offset X to try to isolate and understand what am I doing wrong. So if I go ahead here and save this and try to run it one more time, let's see if we're just getting that X. So we're definitely not getting that X at all, but yet it's passing through our if condition. So let's double check. Maybe there isn't support in the browser for offset X in the current browser that I'm running. So let's go ahead and do a console log and see we are here. And again, old school debugging. I'm basically checking to see if I'm in that if statement, and you can see that I'm not even getting into that if statement, which is basically telling me that this value that is coming through is not equal to undefined, even though it's coming back as a value of undefined. So my if condition is not going through. And when I'm looking at this, I'm realizing what my mistake was, because the point X really doesn't exist, because this property doesn't exist in my browser currently. So I need to say if it doesn't exist, because if a value is there, we don't need to run it again. And if the value is not there, only then we're going to go inside of here we are. Here are we. To be more accurately. And now I could go ahead and do that console to the log to check it out. So I'm more or less being a little bit future ready for a point when offset X and offset Y will actually be available. And this is what you would do with kind of like properties that you know are not fully supported, and you could create these first setting them up or asking if they exist and then configuring them. And now if I go ahead and I check this again, I should get my X and Y coordinates whenever I click on anywhere on the screen. In this lecture, we explored a lot of things, but in the end of it, we got our points within the map. It's time for us to take those points and try to figure out of them the latitude and longitude, and that's exactly what we're going to do in the next lecture. In the last lecture, we fetched the point on the map, the XY coordinates of the map, but we need to transcribe that into latitude and longitude, which is exactly what we're going to do in this lecture inside of our React component. Alright, so the next step now that we have points on our map is to actually convert them into latitudes and longitudes. Now, generally speaking, latitudes and longitudes are literally just taking the world map and splitting it in half. And the center point, when we go up or down, would affect the latitude. If we go left or right, would affect the longitude. Now, the latitude is really divided into 90 degrees up or 90 degrees down, while the longitude is 180 degrees right or 180 degrees left. With that said, our starting point is at 0, 0 in the center of our map. This is an accurately set up or relatively accurately set up map. So let's go ahead, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into our let and add a few more properties. One is I want to define the actual size of a latitude. So I'm going to call that lat size. Now our lat size is going to basically be our image, our image's height, divided by 180 because we said it's 90 degrees to either point. So I need to figure out how much is actual each step in latitudes. For longitudes, same story applies, only this time we need to take our image width and divide it by 360 to give us a full circle really and give us the full longitude. Okay, so we figured out our latitudes size, you could say, each latitude, each single latitude, and so we've done also for our longitude. So the next step for us is to try to figure out the actual longitude and latitude. Now I can't do this up here because our point might not be configured yet, so I'm just going to go ahead and declare a lat and also a long, but not actually convert them and build them out. Once we're done setting up our point, it's time for us to go to that lat and try to figure it out. So first of all, the first point that I'm going to need to do is I'm going to take the actual point that I've fetched from the point creation, and let's start from the latitude, which would accept the y. Now for the latitude, I'm going to take that y and I'm going to subtract out of it basically the point of the image, which is basically right slap in the middle of the image. So what I want to do is I'm going to take my image dot height and I'm going to divide it by 2. Now that I've divided our height by 2 and I got my actual point distance from that actual point to that point, it's time for me to take all of that and divide it by my lat size. Now I need to do one more thing because I need to flip the direction. Currently the direction is going to be basically negative to positive when I want it to be the exact opposite because we're going through height. And in our situation, this would be in the negative space and this would be in the positive state. But I really want to flip the script here. So I just need to put here a minus somewhere in the process. I could put it right here. That works for me as well. So I'm basically switching the direction, making sure that a positive turns into a negative and a negative into a positive. And if I go ahead and test this out, just our latitude, and we just go ahead and click somewhere here, we'll see that as we are in the upper areas, the number is going to be positive. And as we go down, the number will be negative all the way to 90 degrees. It's going to be hard for us to get exactly 90, but we're going to get very close to it. And again, our accuracy is not the most important thing right now, although it would be in a real world scientific application. Okay, so really we're going to use some sort of, we're going to have to give, we'll get to that when we're in the web service to try to give it a value that will be a range to give us more possibilities of getting our value. So again, I'm going to go ahead and also do the same thing for our longitude. So I'm going to go ahead here and set that long. This time around, I'm going to take the X position instead of the Y and subtract the width of our element. And last but not least, I don't need that minus because it's going to go in the right direction naturally and use our lon size instead. So if we go ahead here and we check our latitude and longitude, and I go ahead here and click on a far distance here, it should be negative for our almost 180 degrees exactly. And if we're in the center, it'd be close to 0. And if we're all the way on the other edge, it should be roughly 180 degrees. So we got all our numbers combined and we got our latitude and longitude, and we're just about ready to call a web service and get our data to find out what is the actual content going on in here. In this lecture, we saw how to create or convert our points into latitude longitudes. And it's time for us to turn our attention to our web service. But just before we do that, let's explore some ES6 string templates to simplify the process of creating the URL for our web service. We are almost ready to call our web service, but before we could do that, to simplify things, I'm going to show you how to work with ES6 string templates before we actually call that web service. Now, the ES6 string templates are really aimed at making strings easier instead of having a lot of pluses whenever you need to add variables inside of a string. So let's see them in action. Okay, we have our latitude and longitude configured, and it's time for us to move into our web service. And again, by the way, you'll find the link to our web service in the documentation provided or the links provided in the platform that you are in. We're going to be using the city's JSON web service because it's the most near to basically what we're doing, JavaScript. So JSON is absolutely our favorite whenever we have that option. By the way, I created an account that you're more than welcome to use, which is called Geek. It has a limited usage, so if it doesn't work, you have to create a free account yourself on this website as well. But you could see that our web service here is working, and it has a few parameters that we could send into it, among them the language, which I'll change it to be English. Last but not least, we're going to go ahead and start working on that north, south, east, west configurations. And these and I'm just going to copy the URL and just paste it right inside here, so we could take a look at it. And let me just word wrap everything here. So what's going on here, what I really need to do is to be able to replace the content in that south, west, north, and so forth, and basically replace that content with the content of our variable here, and probably a range because we need to send here a box. So to create this range, I'm just going to create a variable called range, and because we're working in angles, I'm going to make a really big range, but you could choose a much smaller range. So I'm going to ask for a range of 1 degree. With that said, I want to go inside and actually basically I want to take the string as a string and change the different values in here. Now the best way to do that in ES6 is using something that is called template strings. Now in template strings, instead of defining a string as a straight on string as we've done right here, instead of that I'm going to put the relatively weird comma that you find just next to your numbers digits, so right before 1 on the left side if you're on a laptop or a computer, you'll find this odd kind of like comma. And this odd comma, which is not the same as, by the way, as just a regular quote, it's more of a apostrophe type of comma. Now, there you go, that's the word. So I'm going to take it as this string and I'm just going to go ahead and save it as our web service. And by doing this, by the way, it's still going to work. It's going to convert everything in here into a string. But one of the really powerful features in ES6 besides this addition is our capability to go to different points inside of our application, inside of the string template. For example, in the north area, I could just go ahead here and just delete the content there and type $ opening curly bracket, closing curly bracket. And now I could put inside here an expression. For example, in our case, I want to take the latitude and I want to add into that latitude our range. The same I could apply also for our south, so $ open curly bracket, close curly bracket, and then I'll have your lat minus R. Same applies for our east and west. So for our east and west, again, $ open and close curly brackets. And this time around, instead of going to our lat, I'm going to go to our lon. And for our east, we need it to be plus. So we're going to plus on the east. And for our west, we are going to do the exact opposite. So let me just grab that, replace it, and change it to be minus. Now, if I go ahead and all this complicated creation, and forgive my editor because currently it doesn't support ES6, so it looks a little bit weird, but if you do a console log and you log in your web service, and by the way, because because we are working in ES6, and because we have the converter, the Babel converter that is going to basically be automatically configuring and downgrading it to ES5 with the help of our Webpack, which basically this is the code right here that actually makes it transcribe from ES6 to ES5 when it's compiling down. If we go back into our application and we go into the map itself and click somewhere, we'll see that it replaced the content and formatted it actually to put in the values exactly as they need to be. So that's it. So we created the right link, and in the next lecture we're going to go ahead and actually call the web server and process the information that is being returned. In this lecture, we built out our web service URL using string templates, which are new to ES6. In the next lecture, now that we have our web service path ready, it's time to us to call that web service and connect to it. In the last lecture, we created our web service URL dynamically using web templates, or string templates more accurately. This lecture is about connecting to that web service, and we're going to do that natively without using jQuery or any other third-party tool, although there are tools that could simplify the process a bit. But with that said, we're going to use XML HTTP request, which by the way, you could use that also to load XML, but really it's used to load up anything. And in this scenario, we're going to go ahead and load up our web service, which technically we'll choose to use JSON because it's just easier to work with it. So let's see it in action. All right, let's continue. So we have the path and it's time for us to actually call the web service. And to do that, I'm going to go into my map, back into that onClick event. And what I want to do in that onClick event is basically call a web service, or the most common and easiest way to do that is to create a new XML HTTP request. Although this is not really XML, we could do it and create it in the same type of structure. So I'm going to go ahead and create that variable of XHR that will represent a new XML HTTP request. And by the way, this is really commonly supported on all browsers. And let me just fix here the typo. And it's supported, so we don't have to worry about it too much besides start using it. And I'm going to go ahead and open a new call. And I'm going to call a get call. And then I'm basically going to convert our variables here to be URL encoded. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and well, not URL encoded, I'm just going to go ahead and send our web service path as part of our links that we're sending, because everything here is in valid HTML format. We don't need to format it more than that. Now that we have our web service being sent, it's time for us also to actually listen to the situation where our web service is being actually used. So I'm going to have here an onload, and I want to show you something really cool. And this is called arrow functions. Now, arrow functions enable me, they're built this way, open, close, round, bracket. Now, there's more specificalities to them that we might meet throughout our title, but this is a shorthand way to write a function in ES6, especially inline type of functions. Now, what this is going to give me is that my this will remain the this of the object that is outside of it. So it's not going to turn into that XHR or whatever else it will want it to be. Our this will remain the actual object or our actual map, which will be very, very useless. Really, in this situation, it's going to remain the this of the onClick, which probably is not that useful for us at the moment, but we'll fix that in a moment because we're going to keep the this coming throughout our application because we're going to want access to it. With that said, I'm going to go inside of here and I'm just going to ask if our status code equals 200, or we could say even equals 200. And in that case, we know that everything is okay. So we could go and do here a small console call. And let's just go ahead and print out our response text. Response text. Beautiful. And in any other case, we'd probably want to do some sort of error management. But in our case, we're not going to worry about the errors for the sake of this run. So let's go ahead and give it a shot. But before we run it, we have to go ahead and also set it to actually send that value out and actually run our web service call. And if I go ahead and save this and go back into my application, we will see that when I click on specific regions, by the way, it didn't refresh. There we go, it's refreshed. And we click on a specific area, we'll see that we're going to get the web service return us results. So already we're in a really, really, really great shape. So let's go ahead and continue and get this all connected and webbed up. For me to really do something here, I really want to be able to reference back and create basically a change inside of my application, or really a change inside of my class. So far, we never experienced changes inside of our component. Once it was created, that's it, it's done. In the next lecture, what we're going to do, we're going to continue down exactly from this point that we're in right now, resolve our problem of losing our scope in here, because if I go inside of here and I ask what is this, our this is not going to be what we really need it to be. So we're getting back null, which is really not useful for us. So we're going to change that situation. We're going to show you why and how that works as we go ahead and also integrate and get our component to actually know when something changes. In this lecture, we saw how to load up web services natively without leveraging or using third-party tools. In the next lecture, now that we have the data in our application, it's time to connect it into our component and also learn a new thing, which is states. In this last lecture in this section, we're going to learn about state, which is different than properties in React. We're going to understand what they are and what their difference is from properties. With that said, we're also going to connect our map. We're going to learn how to keep our scope. We're going to learn how to work with a constructor. And moreover than that, we're going to learn how to use the React state. And in the process, we're going to introduce you to Griddle, a component that enables you very easily to add visual grids onto your screen. So let's jump right into it. Okay. It's time for us to connect the dots, and the last step that's left for us to do is actually visualize the change and actually get our component to be aware of a change of its state. And that's exactly how it is called. So let's go ahead and create that. I'm going to go into the beginning of my class, and I'm going to create a new function called a constructor. This is also part of those new things in ES6 where the constructor itself is basically a function that is automatically called whenever you're creating a new instance of a class. Now, specifically, the component class expects inside of the constructor to have a props property. More accurately, we need to go ahead and send whatever is happening in the constructor to the constructor of React. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and call the command super and then send in the props. So that way our React component could take care of the props, making sure that they'll be available to us throughout the application. The next thing that I want to do is I want to show you how to solve that problem of scope that we're going to encounter in our onClick, as you saw when we tried to do a log inside of here. We didn't get our this. So really the reason is because we're not getting that this here either. So literally if I go ahead here and I just run my application just one more time and we click somewhere, we'll see that we're getting null and null. So it's not passing through, although this function method, which is called an arrow function, automatically captures whatever the this is outside of it. So in our case, to make sure that our onClick always keeps scope and doesn't change any scope, in my constructor, I'm going to go ahead and ask to change the onClick to be the onClick dot bind to this, making sure that anytime onClick is being called, this will remain the same. Now if I go ahead and save that and check it out in my application one more time, we'll see that we're not going to lose our scope anymore perfectly, because we really need access to that scope now that we're going to start working on states. So I'm going to go ahead here and I'm going to create that state variable. And by the way, this works with built-in to React. What I'm going to do is just define an object that's going to have inside a few properties. For example, in this case, I just am going to have cities, and by default, it's going to be an empty array of cities. In reality, our web service will return to us multiple cities whenever we're clicking on a place which has cities. Now that I defined a state and I know my component now knows that it should expect something to change, once something changes, for example, when we're inside of this onClick event and we got that information back literally inside of this line 36 where we were looking for our this area, what we want to do is we want to declare to React, by the way, something changed. To do that, I'm going to call this.setState. And the setState expects an object of state. And I'm going to go ahead here and just override that city's parameter, accepting the value as we saw previously, which is our xhr.response text. Now, this is not good enough because I don't want it to come back as a string as it is right now. I want to convert it into JSON. So to do that, I'm going to use the built-in JavaScript feature of json.parse. And I'm just going to wrap it around there, making sure that my response is going to be in JSON. And just also because I already know in advance the value that is going to come back is going to sit all inside of a property called GeoNames. So I know it's going to be in there, so I'm going to cut through that GeoNames and just get all those cities, all those city names. If I go ahead and save this, I'm not going to see anything change yet because we don't have anything visually changing, although what's actually happening, React is telling itself, hey, you probably need to refresh, check to see if something needs to be updated. In our case, because we're not actually adding anything, we're not seeing a change. So let's go ahead and change that fact that we're not changing anything. And to do that, what I want to do is I want to use a third-party tool to basically list out all the values that are coming through. To do that, I'm going to stop our server and I'm going to go and ask from npm to install. And I'm going to go ahead and save it because we're going to need it in our production. We're going to install Gradle/React. Gradle/React is literally a library that enables us to create grids inside of our application very easily. Now that it's installing, while it's being installed, I'm going to go ahead and import it. And I'm going to import Gradle from Gradle React. And now that I have access to Gradle, I'm just going to go ahead immediately, directly, and change our body of our rendering because I want to include also that grid. So let me just go ahead and break lines here a little bit. And I'm going to close that div as well. But now that I'm sending that image, I'm going to go ahead and also call for a new Gradle. Now let me just move everything so you can see it more easily. But yeah, that's what I was saying. And it expects a property called results, where we'll actually send inside the data itself that it's expecting. In this case, I'm going to go to my state.cities, and what's actually going to happen now is, and by the way, documentation for Gradle is provided as well, where you could explore a lot more things that you could do with Gradle. But if I go back into my browser, and this time around, just go ahead here, and let me just clear a little bit of that noise, and click somewhere. Oh, by the way, our server is not running yet, so we have to make sure that it's running. So let me go ahead and call npm start. And our server should be running now. So let's go ahead here and let's clear that nonsense up. Oh, here we go. And let's clear that up. And let's click here somewhere. And what's going to happen, it's going to return to me an object and also build out a list with all the cities that have specific names. So for example, if we go to this area, which I believe is Mexico, we should now find different cities inside of Mexico. Let's double check if that's really Mexico. Do we have here any Mexico City? Let's double check. And by the way, one thing is also we might not be incredibly accurate with our calculations, but we are more or less. In this lecture, we leverage Gridle, we learned about state, and we've learned a lot of more ES6 features that relate to components in general and scope. In the next section is going to be dedicated to a new source type where we're going to take a look at CSV files, and through them we're going to create a bar chart. Welcome back to a new section where we continue our exploration of data, where this time our hero is CSV files, and with them we will create a bar chart. So in this section we're going to take an overview as well on Webpack and package.json. We've seen it before, but we're going to take a deeper look into how they actually work. We're going to learn a lot more React.js features and understand better the actual ideas behind of React. We're going to load in a CSV file. We're going to create a bar chart using chart.js. And we're also going to take a look at how do we configure our data to fit our needs, or how do we convert that CSV file to be more specifically useful for our needs in our chart. With that said, let's jump right into our first lecture where we're going to be reviewing package.json and the Webpack configurations. We're going to load in a CSV file, and we're going to learn on the basics of NPM and configurations of Webpack. Just as in previous sections, I went ahead and copied our starter files, and I want to go ahead and focus for a minute on package.json. Now, if you want to learn a lot more about that and NPM in general, I strongly urge you to check out my title, Full Stack React, if you haven't checked it out yet. With that said, you probably could find it in the same platform that you're in right now, which will give you a better, deeper connection of all the different technologies that we're weaving in this title and throughout, and really give you the foundations that will make this title much easier. With that said, it's so important that I wanted to just walk through the basics of package.json. Now, package.json in general, its main structure is really definitive of it's really a structure where we have all these information that we provide in advance to NPM or Node.js for that matter when it's building out the application. So it has all these pre-configurations that make it easier for you to move files around. Just like we saw, we had all of these presets that I've pre-configured to make sure that our application will be able to run and transcribe whatever code we have into the version that we want our server to run in. That's where we put our dev dependencies. And our dependencies are the things that we wanted to use live while the application is running, not something that we're preparing and then not using once it's actually running. And in that case, we had our polyfill, which made sure that older browsers would have the things that they need to be able to continue supporting working with modern ES5 type browsers. And we had React and React DOM that we've already explored in some capacity. Now, in this section, I'm going to go ahead and add one more dependency into our dev dependencies that is going to be used by Webpack. We're going to use it later down the line, and it's called DSV Loader. Now, DSV Loader is basically a loader that it's one of those modules in Webpack that enables it when it's loading things up to convert them into the data that we need them to be converted or from to, or to from for that matter. So for example, when we look at our Webpack and you see here there is one loader already configured, this loader basically says any file that you see that is a .js file that is not inside of the node modules folder, then use Babel loader to convert it into from ES6 to ES5. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add now another loader, and the DSV loader is used for CSV files, namely, and what it does is it enables us to basically render out CSV files. or more accurately, it loads it up and converts it into JSON or into objects that we could use inside of JavaScript. Now, generally speaking, so far, you'll notice that we have here these, I don't know what you call those, what is it, hats? Houses? Whatever it's called. Well, these marks, what they say is that we want this library in version 6 and extra features. I'm not going to go into the semantics of it, but what it really says is that we don't want a version of that application that breaks features. So what we're saying is we want version 6, and for that matter, if version 7 will come out, that means it's going to break some functionality, so we don't want it. We're just going to continue getting updates that could be added more features, or it could be bug fixes, but we're not going to have something that breaks things. So whenever a version goes up, we're expecting things to break in the version that's before them. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm asking for version 1.1.0, which basically is saying that I want the stable, well, I want version 1, and I'm fine with it getting updates, but I'm not fine with the number 1 getting updated at all. Now, that's going to make sure that you could use the same dependency. So for example, if you're taking this title in a year from now and DSV Loader has a version 2 that will break the functionality of what we're doing now, you need to make sure that all these versions are the versions that you're working with as well. Now, the reason why I put this as a dev dependency, that is because our actual site doesn't need this converter. We're going to be loading up CSV as we're loading and compiling the application. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and add another loader descriptor logic. I'm just going to go in and add another loader, and the secondary loader, I'm going to give it a test, and that test is going to be similar to the .js, only this time around we're looking for anything that is a CSV file. And in the case of a CSV file, I'm going to say, hey, the loader that we're going to be using is going to be DSV. By the way, I could have wrote DSV loader as well, but DSV works just fine. Same here for Babel. I don't have to write Babel loader. Webpack will automatically understand that what I mean is DSV loader, so we don't have to write it. So for that matter, now that I saved it, in the future, whenever I'm going to try to load something up, whenever it's a JavaScript file, and it's not from the Node modules, it's not the installed and Node packages, then it's going to go ahead and actually convert it to ES5. Same applies that if we find any CSV file and we load them in, they're going to automatically be converted into ES5 code as well, or really into JavaScript for that matter. Okay, so that's basically the basics of how you add dev dependencies. We've done it previously using the installer, but the difference is when we were using installers directly inside of our terminal, we were installing that specific package in that exact moment. So if I'd set npm install well, if I just do install and name of a package, it's going to install it, but it's not going to be added into our descriptions, which we really want that, so anyone that will take our project will automatically be able to install all the things that they need. On the contrary, whenever we set here a save, what it does, it saves it into the dependencies, and when we set it to be with dev-save, then it's going to save it into our dependencies. Into our dev dependencies. But let's go ahead and continue and adding just one more package that we're going to be using in this chapter throughout, and that is going to be the chart.js file. Now, there are actual models for chart.js modules, such as, and I'll add it into the documentation, such as React Chart 2 or React Chart, that add built-in support to charts using React. But deliberately, I'm going to go through the process of showing you how to use a library that was not built for React, and how do you get it to work in React. Because if you know how to do that, you'll be able to do it with many other libraries that don't have currently support for React, or they're not built for React. So for that sake, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it to be version 2. Right now, the current version is 2.1.6, but I'm going to be working on the version 2 version of chart.js. And if you want to learn more about chart.js, check out our documentation which will provide more information. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and save all these changes that I made to my package.json, and now I'm going to go ahead and, as we've done in all the times before, I'm going to ask the npm to install, and what npm install will do, it's going to run through the packages, check to see if there are updates, and also install based on the rules that are provided here that tell it how will it make those type of updates. And by the way, more information again you'll find in my title, Full Stack React. This was just a big picture so you have a better understanding of what is that package.json and how it relates to npm itself. But I strongly encourage you to check that title if you're not very familiar with it, because as we step into more advanced data related things, more and more we're going to have to turn into working with Node.js and also working with other platform parties modules that are relatively not relevant to React, but relevant more to the server itself. So with that said, we'll see you in the next lecture when I'm done installing all the packages that we configured inside of our package.json. In this lecture, we saw how to load up CSV files similarly to how we've done it with JSON files. Beyond that, we also have a better understanding of how things are connected and how they work. In the next lecture, we're going to continue down the path of building out our component as we modify the styles of our component and understand what is the best way of doing that in React. Welcome back. So what we're going to do in this lecture, we're going to be talking about how you add styles to components. And really, I'm just to say that generally speaking, when you're working with regular HTML, you're told all the time to separate your CSS from your HTML, from your code. Contrary to that, the React philosophy is bundle up components and make them simple for you to work with. So adding styles directly into your HTML in React is not a negative per se. It is actually almost even encouraged. And we're going to take a look at how do you actually do that in React. And in the process, we're going to set up a new canvas, which we're going to use for the creation of all the different charts using Chart.js. All right, now that we have everything installed, or at least where we have everything there, let's just go ahead and also start our file. And when I'm saying that everything is installed, I'm really talking about our two new packages that we've added in, which was our package that is going to enable us to load in CVS files as we're building out the application, and the package chart.js, which will enable us to create charts. So with that said, let's go into our client and start building out and configuring out our logic. Or how about let's start with a component, and I already created a components folder, and in it I want to create a file, and let's call this chart.js, because we're going to have here something that will be able to be basically any chart, theoretically speaking at least. Okay, so now with that said, what do we need for our chart to do? So first of all, we're going to need to import React from React. Just like always, we're going to need to import our chart from chart.js. And really, because we're naming our package chart, let's go ahead and just call this chart.js, so it's very clear the difference. Well, not that clear, but clear for us at least. Export default class chart extends react.component. Beautiful. And let's go ahead and do a render. Now, our render function, and we're really just doing our first steps here. In our render function, what I'm going to do, I'm going to return a canvas. The reason is because Chart.js expects a canvas. Now, I'm going to go ahead and I'm not going to set a width and height to it. And the reason is because it really doesn't matter what width or height I'm going to give it, because React will automatically, not React, actually Chart.js will automatically resize and try to get it to be in the biggest zone that it can. Now, if we wanted to undo that and could give it a little bit of control over the levels of where it could or how big it could go to, a very good way of doing that is just setting a div layer above it and giving it a style rule. Now, styles in React, I could literally just send an object into the style itself. So if the first curly bracket was to let everyone know that we have an object, we're putting here a reference, and inside I'm building out a variable. So for example, I want to set the width to be 900, let's say. I want my height to be 300, let's say. And how about we'll also set a background color, and we'll set that to be blue. And let me go ahead here and just put here a little bit of a word wrap. And let me go ahead and save this. Okay, so that's going to be our component, our starting point component. Let's go into our client and actually pull it in and actually use it. So to do that, again, I'm going to have to grab out that import. So let me just copy that and use it again. We're going to definitely need the React. We're also going to need React.js. And we're also going to need our chart. So it's called chart. It's positioned inside of our components folder, and it's called chart. I think that's all we need. Now we could go ahead and delete that, and let's give it a run and try React DOM, render. What are we rendering? Chart. For now, we're not going to send anything into it, and I'm going to go ahead and define our document get element by ID and send it to our React, which is an ID element inside of our HTML. Now, if everything is working, we shouldn't really see much, but we should see something here, which is basically just going to be our canvas size that we configured. Beautiful. So we're ready in a fantastic starting point. In the next lecture, we'll continue into integrating the actual React chart itself and start working with it and understand where do we actually put it if we have to configure and set that canvas in advance, and then how do we influence it once it's already configured. In this lecture, we explored styles and set up our canvas. In the next one, we'll continue preparing our chart data for the chart that we're going to be creating really soon. Before we could start working with our chart.js, which we'll be doing really soon, we need to prepare data for it. And for that, we have this lecture where we'll create our data. Now, data, generally speaking, should never live within a React component. There's a lot of logic to it, and the biggest one is that React components should be built for reusability. And if you bake inside of them actual text, then they're not really reusable. And that's really the biggest main reason why you shouldn't. So let's jump right into it and let's see where should you put your data and what data we need for our component. Okay, before we start charting, the next thing we gotta do is we need to prepare the data that our chart is gonna need. So to do that, I am definitely not gonna put the data inside of our chart component. And I ask you why. Pause the video, think about it. Good, you thought about it. The answer is because we don't want our components to have hard-coded data inside of them, because I'm creating a component that is generic. It's called chart. Now, if I put data inside of it, that's it. Now it's bounded to whatever data that is in it. So I really don't want to put inside of React component hard-coded data. Instead of that, I'm going to go to our client area, and there I'm going to create the data itself and then send it into our chart. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a new let. And you know what? Let's learn about something new. Just like there is a let, there is also a const. And const assumes that the content doesn't change. With that said, a lot of developers, they just choose to set everything to be a constant. That way they'll get errors whenever something changes. And only if they really wanted it to change, then they'll go ahead and move it from a const to a let. That way you get a lot more detailed feedback whenever something is not exactly the way you need it to be. Now, generally speaking, our charts or our chart.js component is going to need three main data points. The first one is going to be a type that is going to tell it what type of chart is it going to be. In our case, our first chart we're ever going to create is going to be a bar chart. The next item that it's going to expect is going to be data object, which will hold all the information that would be inside of that component. The next thing will be options that will give it us some customizations that we could do to the library itself. For now, we're going to keep the options empty, but I'm going to start off with our data. And in the data object, the first item is going to be labels. Now, the labels themselves are going to be the array of the data sources that we're going to have. For example, in this case, I'm going to go ahead and just copy paste an array that I've pre-configured and pre-created, and this array is just a list of names: Ben, James, Mary, Sam, and Gloria. Those are our subjects that we're going to be using inside of our bar chart. The next item that we're going to have is a data set. Now, data sets work in a very similar way to how you would expect them. They basically list out information. Now, because charts have dimensions, each data set is going to be in an object, and each data set will basically contain only one variable. So for example, we're going to set here a label, and let's say that label is going to be fun. And for the fun variable, we need to set the data that corresponds to the items that were previously. So let's say Ben is fun from between 0 to 100. Ben is really fun. James, not that fun. Mary is really not fun. Sam is a blast. And Gloria, not that fun. Although this seems a little bit sexist because the girls are not fun and the boys are really fun. So how about we make Sam completely not fun and Gloria is a blast. Okay, so we have here a first data set, and we could create as many data sets as we really need. Each data set, in this case, because we're creating a bar chart, would represent one bar associated to these items. So if I go ahead and I create another data set there, and let's say this time around, instead of fun, we'll set smart, and let's say that I'm really smart, and although it's a myth, James is a complete fool, Mary is a genius, Sam is a genius, and Gloria is beyond genius. Okay, so these are our data sources, and we could have even more than that. It's really up to you. Last but not least, really, let's talk about visuals. So we could go ahead and also, as properties of our chart, go ahead and add, for example, a background color. Now this background color could be an array, but I don't encourage you to do so because we really want fun to be in one color. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll just set here a value, which could be any value that is acceptable in CSS3. In this case, I'm just going to set it to be red with a 20% opacity. Okay, so I just set it to be red with a 20% capacity, and I'm going to go to my border width. And again, these are just properties that you could find in the description of chart.js of things that it expects. And let me just go ahead here and just duplicate this. And for our smart variable, I'm just going to go ahead and set here the color to be, let's say, blue. So it's going to be blue at 20%. And again, border width, I'm fine with a border width of 1, or how about let's set a border width of 2. And by the way, I could set a border color as well. So for border color, I could just go ahead here and say, okay, your border color will be basically blue as well, but instead of that, it's going to be 40%. Okay? So with that said, we're not really ready yet to test things out. We don't have anything in our options, but I do want to send this information into our chart. Now, the easiest way to send data, especially if I want to break it apart, what if I wanted to send the type, the data, and the options? Historically, we saw that you could just type data. Oh, let me just break a few lines here so you guys can see better. And then I would basically do an equal, open and close around a curly bracket, and then I could just go and say, hey, I want to send the data. But what if I wanted to send the options? So I would have to say data.options and data.options. A big pain in old style JavaScript. This is not even old style, it's like getting new type of JavaScript. Now, in JSX, the way you do it, you could literally just send all of that data object, and what's actually going to happen inside of the charts component, it's actually going to retrieve the type, the data, and the options as separate items that belong to the props command. So it won't be this.props.data. Instead of that, you would have this.props.type.data options, so you basically have access to all of them much more easily without needing to type data within the chart. Now we're not ready yet because we have to actually implement the chart on the other side, which is exactly what we're going to do in the next lecture. In this lecture, we saw how to configure our data and where we should place it. In the next one, we'll continue down the path of actually connecting it to a real chart using chart.js. Before we jump into this lecture and see how to connect our data and create our bar chart within React, I want to talk a little bit about the React way. Now, generally speaking, we already saw that we have the React component, the React library, and the React DOM library. While the React was in charge of our components, the React DOM was in charge of the communication with the browser itself. This separation was done for a very good reason. For one, to enable them to create different components, different rendering engines for different environments without changing our code. But secondarily, and one of the more important reasons, is because when we manipulate the DOM directly, it creates a lot of overhead, and this is really where the slowness of JavaScript lives. So by separating these steps, it's actually making our JavaScript a lot smarter because it's not going to be rendering as soon as we request it. And that really moves us to our problem where when we render an element, it's not actually rendered as soon as we ask it to render. That happens behind the hood when React is ready to render it. So to be able to solve that problem, because that is a problem for us to create our chart, we need access to the canvas that we've created that currently we wouldn't have within the component. To solve that problem, we're going to use the component did mount method, which is a callback that is called once the component is actually on the screen. With that said, this is specifically only a solution for a solution that is actually to the screen. For that matter, React DOM is good, but if we were working with React DOM server, well, that function would never be called, and thus our component is now tied to only components that are living within a React environment that is running on an actual client-side implementation. With that said, let's take a look at how do we get it up and running. Okay, it's time for us to actually move from the client into our component area itself and start rendering out. Now, for chart.js to be able to gain access to our canvas, it actually needs the canvas to already be on the stage. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to add another built-in method that exists within any React component and override it. And I'm going to call the component did mount. For our component did mount function, what I want to do is I want to make basically additional changes or modifications to our canvas. Now, as our canvas itself, for React's purpose, is really just never changing, all I really need is to gain access to it to be able to draw inside of it. Now, that's exactly what chart.js does. So in this case, what I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to call that canvas, and to be able to gain access to that canvas, I need to give it a reference. So literally what I'm going to do is I'm going to call a ref and just give it a name. In this case, I'm just going to call it chart. Now that it has a name inside of my component did mount, I could literally fetch it and get it. The way I do that, and I'm just going to go ahead and create a new const now that we know what consts are, and I'm going to gain the context. I'm going to ask from this.refs the actual chart, and then I'm going to get the context, which is 2D, which this is already all standard JavaScript stuff where I'm going to get the context of our chart itself in 2D, which is what our chart expects for. Now that I have that information, I could go through the next step, and the next step is I also want to gain access to a few more properties. And by the way, I want to gain the properties of type, data, and options that I've sent in from the client itself. Remember, the type, data, and options. So how do I gain that access? I could use another const, or just for the sake of practice, let's create a let instead of that. And it's really cool. This is one of my favorite new features in ES6, where I could literally just type a list of the things that I want to grab out of an object. It's called to transcribe, I think, or trans something, doesn't really matter, but you actually set the names of the properties that you want and then set the equal sign to the actual object that you want to break apart and rip out of it the type, data, and options, and it will automatically just fetch those three that we need, which is really convenient for us, because what we're going to do next is I'm going to go ahead and create here a chart. I'm going to give it a reference so I could have access to it again in the next chapter, because we're going to continue with the sample in the next chapter and talk about how do we clean things up and make sure that our chart doesn't override itself over and over and over and over, making it break, which is not a good thing, or create a memory leak, which is not a good thing as well. But we're not going to deal with that now. We're going to deal with that in the next chapter. In this chapter, I want to just create the actual chart itself, and the first property it expects is that context, and the second property will be an object that will store inside a type, which is type. We'll store a data type, which in our case is data because we fetched it, and options, which in our case is options as well, conveniently. And that's really all we had to do to get our chart to actually run. And if we go ahead and give it a shot and we don't have an error, but we don't have an error. Oh, this blue is blocking everything probably. Let's go ahead and get rid of it. Although I don't think it is. Or that I'm not typing here something correctly. So maybe let me just go ahead here and just set here New chart. There you go. I'm basically creating it inside of myself. You see, I told you that the name that we picked was a really bad name. So let me go ahead and I'm setting it to chart.js because that's the library, not anything else. So I had nothing to do with the color, but we don't need that color anymore. And let's go ahead and give it another shot. So good. We're starting to get errors, which is already good because so it's first of all, it's telling me that it can't find the data set inside of data. So let's go and see do we have a data set. Maybe we have a typo in the word data set. That looks to me so brilliantly fine. Data set. Let's see what it's actually saying here. No, this is just like while we're compiling stuff, so that's fine. This is really what's concerning us, that it's the data sets, plural, not single. So it's data sets. Data sets, save that baby. And let's go ahead and take a look, and beautiful. We finally have a chart and it's running. And by the way, it's a little bit too big, so let's go ahead here and just make it slightly smaller by setting my height to be 250, let's say, and maybe my width will be 800. And once we render, our chart should be a tad smaller, which is working brilliantly for us now. And we have ourselves a beautiful chart. Now, we're far from done with working with charts. As you notice, we're just starting to explore this wonderful world of data visualization. But in the next lecture, what we're going to do is we're going to revisit our data source and make it external, which is going to be a little bit more tricky because we are going to use a CSV file to replace the actual content that we created in the client, and then try to figure out how do we build this content out so it will actually match up to the structure that it expects. Okay? In this lecture, we saw and understood that limitation of the render method and saw how to implement and integrate our React component using component did mount method. In the next lecture, we're going to go ahead and format our data and prepare it for an even more complex structure. While you're living inside of our nest, the data that you're retrieving is perfect for your needs. But in the real world, the data that you're getting, that if it's from JSON, if it's from XML, if it's from a CSV file like we've been exploring, your data is not going to match the actual needs of the components. In our case, chart.js expects a data format that is completely different than the default built-in converter from CSV to an object. And that's exactly what we're going to explore right now. We're going to take that CSV file, convert it to an object, which is what the plugins are giving us, but then we're going to take that object and convert it to match to the needs of chart.js. But through this experience, you're going to learn about how to do this to any object. How do you convert that data instead of changing the code? And in many situations, you can't change the code. So your best solution is to modify the content to fit the code that you already have. Okay, let's start our journey, which is a real journey, because what we want to do is we want to load in data, but also convert it to match this format. And by the way, border wasn't true, but actually border, there was an extra A there. Apologies for that. And oh, here you go, a much more beautiful border. Let's continue. So let's go ahead and load up our CSV. Now, as a reminder, in our first lecture in this title, in this chapter more accurately, we went ahead and added the loader for CSV, which is DSV loader. And we've also loaded it up. It's one of the dependencies of our dev dependencies, the DSV loader version 1.1. So let's go ahead, and what I want to do is I want to go into my client itself, and I'm just going to go ahead and import, and I'm going to call this data2 from, now where, oh, by the way, I forgot to mention that I went ahead and I created a new data.csv file. Now, if you don't know what CSV files are, generally speaking, a CSV file is a comma separated text document that many editors know how to build it out into a table chart, but really what all it really is literally just like a list of properties and then a list of content or values, based column values, you could say, where you have a comma and a line break to represent them. Some use other ways, but that's more common, the most common way that it is done. There's also a way where you have a semicolon, or there is no break, there's a tab instead. There's a few different ways that you could configure it, but the default usually is the way you could see just right now. So with that said, let's go ahead and load it up. And where are we loading it from? Well, we're currently in the source folder, so we want to get out of the source folder and then into the data folder, and then into our data.cvs. Now, again, our loader, our Webpack will recognize that this is CSV. Why CVS? CSV file. It will recognize that it's a CSV file because we put that here, right here, as a test, and then it's going to load it up using DSV. And what's actually going to happen is if we come back into the client right here, and let me just go ahead and I'm going to do a console.log for our data2, you'll see that our object should be loaded up and plopped right into it once our re-rendering will be done. By the way, we don't need all that stuff. And we can see that we have here our object, and if we take a look at this array of objects, the first object will basically contain fun, smart, witty, name, and so forth. So basically what's actually happening, it's actually going through and skipping the first property, in our case from what we could see here, and it's listing out all the different values, literally, well, not skipping, it's basically taking, if you take a look at it, if we take a look at it for a second, it's basically taking these values and assigning an object with a name, Ben, fun, and so forth, and going one after each other. Now, this structure is beautiful, but it doesn't respond to our actual need, because if we take a look at our object itself, our data structure is quite different. So maybe we're not going to change the data that is a bar, but everything inside of here is really built differently. So what we need to do is we're going to have to loop through this data and maybe reconstruct the real data object. All right, so what we're going to do is let's take it step by step. Now, the first thing is we need to really create a structure that is similar to the data structure. And by the way, what we're going to go through right now is something that you're going to go through anytime you get data that doesn't fit the format of the data that you need. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to start with a let, and I'm just going to create a variable with a generic name of object, really just for our next chapter where we're going to start making our code cleaner. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and take that data2 object and take out of it, not a shirt, but take out of it and shift out of it the first item. Once I've shifted out the first item, I'm going to go ahead and create a formatted data variable. And I'm just going to set it based on the data formats here. So I know that there's labels. So for our labels itself, we already have the first object. So let's just put into it already the first item name, which is going to be mine, surprisingly. And for our datasets, I'm going to go ahead and set it as an empty array to start things up. Now, the reason why I'm taking out the first object is because I want to make sure that I don't need to have an if statement in my for loop, and instead of that I'm going to have one for loop that will actually run through and prepare everything, so our second loop will be a lot easier to run. Now I'm going to also set up a map which is basically new, well, not only basically, it's new to ES6, which enables us, just like we would have with an object that has a key and set it with a value, same applies for a map. Only in a map you could also put inside here an object as a reference if you wanted to, and whatever value you want on the other side. That is the only and a really big, really cool feature. Although we're not going to actually use that, we could have used just a simple object as a hashing object, but just for the sake of saying that this is a new feature, I decided to add it in. With that said, okay, so now that we already use the name itself, I'm going to go ahead to that object and delete out of it that name, because we don't need it in the original object anymore. Because what I want to do is I want to loop through the remaining items inside of there to basically go through every single item and position and create a data set for it, because every single item was what is it going to be? Let's do a console log so you could actually see it. Each item is basically going to be one of the categories or one of the data sets. So if I go ahead here and just save this and go back into my application and click here on refresh, we should see that we have your fun, smart, witty, and that's exactly the data sets that we have for our application. We created in our CSV file a third column, fun, smart, and witty. So with smart, fun, and witty, let's go ahead and create their data sets for them. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new let inside of my for loop. In other words, it's only going to be available within that loop. And I'm going to call this a data set. Let's just call it DS for short. And I'm going to set a label for it, just like we have labels here. What is the label? That is item. Now, what is the data itself? Well, we only have the first item so far, and the first item is object.item because we're only looping through our first object. So that's our data set. Now, what I want to do now that I've created it, I want to send into our formatted data into its data sets, its new data set. Now, if you're wondering why I separated between the steps and I didn't just go ahead and immediately put in this value inside, which is a very fair question, and the reason is because I want to use our map and I want to basically link between the name itself of the property and the actual object itself, so I could then add into it things without referring directly to the formatted data any longer. So that's it. That's really our first item formatted. The next step for us to format is to go through all the remaining items, and to do that I'm going to go to data 2 and create a for each loop, and I'm going to use a arrow function. We've met arrow functions before because they make sure that this remains the same, so we don't even have to add extra properties for that. And I'll set here object I for index, A for other array, although we don't really need to refer to it. All we really need to do is a few steps. One, we want to add another label. To do that, I'm going to go ahead to the object itself. Let me just push this a little bit forward, and I want to go to labels, and I want to push into it that new name that has just been, we're just looping through. Now that's going to be the name of the person. Now that I've gone ahead and done that, I could delete that object.name because we don't need the name any longer. So again, so we look at it, once we've set the name in, we don't want to loop through it again, so we're getting rid of it. Once we got rid of it, it's time for us to loop through the remaining items inside of our loop. So I'm going to go ahead, and by the way, I could put here a let. It doesn't need to be a var, and if it doesn't need to be a var, then it shouldn't be a var. By the way, we could go right ahead up here and also turn that into a let. Old habits die hard. And this for loop, I don't really need to open and close a curly bracket because it's only one line, but you're more than encouraged to do so if you feel like you need to. And what I'm actually doing in this step is I'm approaching the actual data source that we've configured in the original loop. And in that data set, I'm going to the data property. And in the data property, I am going to push into it the new value that we just got in, which is our object item. And that's all I had to do to create my new data set. All that's left for me to do to test out if our data set works or not, let's go ahead and first do a console log to see how it looks like. So I'm going to just look at our formatted data here for a second. And if we go back into our application and take a look at the data that is actually coming back, we'll see that our object itself has a data set, labels, and for our labels, you'll see all the different names, which is exactly what it needs to be. And for our data sets, we have 3 data sets. One is fun with 11 values, and one is smart with 11 values, and one is witty with 11 values, and that's exactly what we wanted. So it's time for us to test out and see if our new formatted data actually works. And I'm just going to go ahead to our data source here, delete all of its content there, and replace it with formatted data. By the way, that is not needed as well. All of that is gone. If I go ahead and save it, our data is already being sent to our component. We should now get our updated component. Our updated component doesn't have colors, which is your homework assignment, you could say. I will sort that out in the next lecture, which will be in the next chapter, as we start exploring deeper this world and also improving the visibility of our code, because right now our code is so messy. When you take a look at all this logic is something that could be reused easily, but we tied it completely to this data source. What if we want to use other data sources? We'd have to go back into this file and change a lot of things, and that's some of the things that we're going to be looking into in the next lecture as we take a deeper look at formatting data and preparing data in the next lecture and building out a lot more visual data-driven components. In this lecture, we learned a really important lesson about data modification as the best way to change your data instead of changing your code. Instead of having your code answer and be ready for 10 different formats, just create formatters for the data, keeping your code much more simpler because of that. In the next section, we're going to go into a new topic, and in it, we're going to go ahead and dive really deep into the process of creating a reusable chart component that will be the implementation of Chart.js within React world. Welcome back to a brand new and incredibly exciting section where in it we're going to actually create, modify, improve our React component to make it incredibly reusable, and it's actually going to act as the chart.js non-official component that could be used by anyone really that wants to add chart.js into their React applications. So with that said, we're going to also learn about the importance of organizing your code and whatever could be idiomatic, which we'll talk about that in this lecture. We want to extract out and put it into a utility model or extract it into something that is not specifically connected to a client or a server. With that said, we're also in this chapter going to learn how to add random colors, but in that process we're going to learn about the overall idea of searching for things that exist instead of trying to create them yourself. We're also going to take a look at how do we improve and clean our memory leaks that currently exist in our React component, and also dive deep into the world of properties within React. Last but not least, we're going to take a nice foray exploration of the options that are available within chart.js. With that said, let's jump right into our first lecture where we'll be creating a utility module. And the most important thing I want you to get out of this lecture is the concept of idiomatic JavaScript. And the idea itself is incredibly simple. The idea itself is let's create as many JavaScript scripts as we can that could be reusable and not include into them anything that defines them into being a client side or server side or anything else. And that way creating components, or more accurately, creating modules that are then reusable both on the client and the server. And in this case, we're going to take a look at creating a utility function and extract it out into a separate file and use it instead of having it baked into the client, making it unusable for anyone else besides our client. So it's really a lesson about logic placement. Let's jump right into it. Let's see it in action. Welcome back to a brand new section that this time around our section depends on the last chapter, CSV. Make sure to copy the files from chapter 3 into chapter 4. We're not starting from zero, actually we're starting from where we left off in the last section. With that said, let's jump right into the code and let's talk about what we're going to be doing. So let's start off talking about why our client JS right now is rubbish and not good at all. Now, the reason is very simple. It's a double one. One is that we have very specific functionality that in most probability we'll want to use again on different objects, cluttering up our client.js. That's a first problem. The second problem is that we have here a lot of functionality that doesn't relate directly to client-only specific things. Because in reality, if we were building this application on the server as a server-side application, most of the logic here could work on the server as well. And this type of thinking process of improving your code is called idiomatic JavaScript, where you want to remove all code that doesn't really depend on a specific environment and make it stand alone so you could then use it in different types of environments. With that said, let's go ahead and do that. And to do that, I'm going to go into my source folder and create a new folder in there called utils. Now, it's called utils because it's not a component, and it also tells me this is not a React thing. This is a general utility, and it's not the client or a client folder because this doesn't relate only to the client. It could be any source. It could be used by anyone. We're not going to put here anything specifically client related. With that said, let's go ahead and create a file, and I'm just going to call this A for array to chart, a to chart.js. Now I'm going to go ahead and save it, and there we go. So we created ourselves our a to chart file, and I'm going to go ahead and grab all of the things that are more generic. So for that sake, it's really everything here where we're formatting and preparing the actual data itself. So if I go ahead and cut it out, paste it right inside here, but really what I want to do is I want to place it in a function so users could call and use it. So I'll call it A2C for A2C. Well, that's a good name, I think. So I'm going to go ahead and just paste it right in here, and let's just fix a little bit of the formatting and then correct all the things that need to be corrected. First of all, we're going to get an array. Okay, so we don't have any data 2 anymore, and instead of that we have here A for our array. Secondary, we have to also return the value. What is the value that we're returning? It's that formatted data. So we want to make sure also to send our formatted data. And let's just double check if there's anything else we need to change in here. I do believe that all of this is good. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to export this function. But I'm not going to export it as a default, contrary to before. Among the reasons I'm not going to do it because I might have more functions, more helpers inside of this utility that helps us convert charts, arrays into charts. So now that we have it exported in my client itself, let me show you how to use it. First of all, let me change this into raw data. And I'm going to go ahead and also import our helper, import, and it's located. First of all, let's give it a name and let's call it A to C. That works for us as well. But okay, I'm going to show you how to do it. It's actually not that way exactly. We have to actually do some more steps. So one is we're inside of our directory of source. That's good. And then we want to go into utils, and then we want to get A to chart. Beautiful. Now, this is not beautiful because we don't have here a default, contrary to what we were doing previously. So what we want to do is we want to put it in a curly bracket. And what that says, I could put here basically listing out with a comma all the things I want to take. In this case, I only want to fetch out the A to C function. Now that I have the A to C function, I could go ahead here and delete this formatted data. And instead of that, format it on the go by sending in the raw data into the component. And look how much smaller and more compact our structure is, and only things that were very specific to this area are in the client itself, while all generic logic and all logic that we could extract out, we've extracted out and put it inside of our A to chart. And let me just go ahead and make sure that I saved both of them so we could test it out and see if it actually is working. And if everything worked, which it did, then everything will remain exactly the same as it was because nothing actually changed. In the next lecture, I owe you that homework assignment of figuring out how to change colors here so we could actually have variance in the colors of our charts. In this lecture, we really opened your possibilities and ideas for idiomatic JavaScript, but more importantly, organizing your code. The more organized your code is, the better applications you're going to be creating. In the next lecture, now that we have organized code, I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about adding modules instead of creating stuff yourself, leaning on the open community to try to find things. In this case, we're going to use random colors. While this lecture is about adding random colors using the just.randomColor, it's not really the main topic. The main topic connects to the one we had in the last lecture. The idea of componentizing, or more accurately in the language of Node, modularizing, or the language of NPM more accurately. What we're trying to do is create packages that have just specifically what we need. Even if you're not going to be publishing your modules, make sure to extract things out so they become reusable. And in this case, you could also lean on the open source community because there's a lot of mini solutions available out there, just like this sample that we're going to explore in this lecture. All right, let's go ahead and solve our dilemma from the last lecture. And from the last chapter, actually, I just noticed that my Ben, how horrible. I gave myself such great scores, but they are not here. So let's try to see what's going on there before we even do anything else. And by the way, one thing that I could already know just because of its construct, and unfortunately we didn't get any errors, is that the data is not being fed only for the first item. And in that case, I know that my problem must be somewhere here. And it is somewhere where the data itself is put in, and I'll have your object.item, which is incorrect because I need it to be object and no dots there, but instead of that, set that like this. Go ahead and save that. That should sort that out. Okay, so with that said, let's go ahead and fix our color issue. And to do that, I'm going to also use a third-party tool. Now, there's a million different ways you could have done it, but the easiest is using something already ready for us. And to do that, I'm just going to go and install it. This is a Node.js in general script or a JavaScript idiomatic thing because it really just does one thing. It creates a random color. To be able to use it, I need to call npm and install, and I'm going to need this to save it in our production because we're going to be using it in the production. And I'm going to install just.randomColor. Very cool name for a library or a package or a module in this case. So let's go ahead and install it. And while it's being installed, let's start setting up the code. So in A2 chart, I'm going to need to load it up. So I'm going to import random color from just.random color. And once I have it imported, I could start working with it. Where do I want to work with it? Really only in the initiator for loop that is setting up all of our different data types. So let me go ahead here and just add one more property after our data source, and let me call this color. And our color is literally just going to be a new random color, and you're more than welcome to check the documentation to see all the different things that you could do in it, but I'm just going to go and fetch an R. Once I've set the random color, I'm going to set it to be an RGBA color, and now I have a color. Beautiful. The next step that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and start adding into our data source the different properties that I want it to have. So first of all, my data source, I want it to have a background color. And the background color I want it to be is going to be that color we just got as CSS. So to CSS, and again, this is in their documentation. Again, I also want to have a background. I want to also have a border color. And this time around, I'm going to also do that to CSS. Only the difference is the background color, I'm going to leave it with a full opacity in the background, while for our actual background color, I'm going to first go to my color and I'm going to ask for the value and set its alpha channel to be 0.5. So it's going to be 50% of its alpha channel. This was already set as a string, so I have nothing to worry. Now we'll set the next one, and that should be good. And let me also just make sure that it has a border width of, let's say, 2. And let me just go ahead and set these together. It doesn't really matter, but just visually it's more pleasing to me. And if we go ahead and give it a shot, we should first start up our server, npm start. And once our server is running, hopefully we should have a variety of different colors once our application starts rendering. And we sure do, and we have here a lot of different colors. And by the way, you could also set the different varieties of what colors you want it to be, and you could learn more about that on your documentation for just.random color. So in this lecture, we kind of like made a full circle on the topic that we talked about in the last lecture about modules by picking an open source simple module to implement a problem that we've had. In the next lecture, we're going to continue down our path of creating our component, where we're going to clean up memory leaks that are in existence in our component that you're probably not aware of yet. As we mentioned a few times before, your goal when you're creating React components is to extract all the data from the component and send it in through properties, and only use state whenever it's a property that is intended to change in the life cycle of that component. So we're going to take a deeper look into this.props, and with that, lean all of our data on external sources and remove all the hard-coded data that needs to be updatable out of the component. By the process, we're creating a reusable component. Alright, let's continue visualizing our data, and we really have a good familiarity with our component. Although there's one thing we haven't really played with which is the options. So to do that, I'm going to go into my client, and I want to show you a few different options. You know what, even before that, for the type of data that we prepared using our A2 chart, we could use a bar chart, which is what we've been doing so far, but we could have also used, if we wanted to, a horizontal bar. And literally all we have to do now is just change it to horizontal bar. And if we go back into our code, we'll see that now our bars are horizontal. Moreover than that, we could also, let me just go ahead and just save this so you guys can look at it later. You could also place it to be a line. Now there's a lot of different types that you could put there, but the type depends on the data formats that are needed. So we're going to take a look at different types a little bit later, but I just want to show you that those three, so you have your three different types that you could use very, very easily. Now, I want to go back and let me just get rid of line and let's just put it back to our bar because it seemed the cleanest for our purposes right now. And I want to go into the options and show you what are options and how to work with them. So I'm not going to show you every single option. There is a lot of them, and you'll find in our documentation a link to a list of all the options that you could use. And I encourage you and implore you to just scan through them so you're familiar with the different options that you could control your React Chart.js application component that we've just created right now. Okay, so responsive, true. When responsive is true, what it actually means is the default, which basically means that it's going to try to get the component to be the largest that it can inside of the current bounds that is in. So for example, when we were talking previously in our chart and we've created these hard set values of 800 and 250 to our div, if I would get rid of those and I would just set it as a canvas without even setting a width or a height, what will happen, it would automatically try to capture as much of the screen as it can, basically taking over a really large portion, well, the whole screen. It's responsive. Now, what we did is we made it responsive, you could say, within the bounds of this box that we told it that it could live within. Now, this box is hard-coded, which really makes it not really responsive, but in reality, if we just set it this way, and let's say we didn't want it to be responsive, if I just go ahead and save this, I'm just going to go ahead and set here a width of 400, and I'm going to set a height of 400. So this is going to be my height and width of my canvas. Now, if I go into my application and take a look at it, it's actually going to ignore me completely. That is because we are responsive. And once I set responsive to be false, it will respect the size and bounds of the component size that it is when I set it in. So it's going to smash it in and set it to whatever size I set my component to be. And if that's the size that you wanted and you want it hard set, then you could just go ahead and set the actual width and height of your canvas element in advance, and then go inside into your component and set it up thereafter. And by the way, one more thing that we could do here is also, if we wanted to set our chart, if we're really going to set this width and height, we could also set our width and height as a property and just set it to be 400, and we'll set our height to be 400. But if we do that, the one thing that we're going to have to do is when we go inside of our chart itself, one thing is, if you recall, we took out the type data and options. It doesn't really matter that there's more properties in there. It's not grabbing them. But inside of our canvas itself here, we could just go ahead and just set here a value. Instead of putting it to be hard coded, I could just say this dot props dot width. Let me just word wrap here so we could see better. And same applies. I could do just this dot height and just set here the height. And now if I go ahead and let me just put here a different value, and let's say we set the width of 800 and the height of 300, if we go ahead and save this and run it, it should pass through and react. So that way our component is going to be more dynamic, as it should be, because in the end of the day, we don't want to have here actually any size that is configured in advance. Now, one more thing that we could set if we wanted to, but we don't, is to put here maybe not to set a width if a value is not sent, and put here a little bit more extra logic that would define if it's there or not. But how about we do that? Because it would be a really great exercise to see how do you do things in JSX and how do you do things in ES6. So for this matter, let's say that there is a property of width and height. Maybe there isn't. And if there isn't, then we don't want to put anything. So in this case, what we'd want to do is we could set here basically a if. And in our if, and by the way, let me just set here a let, and I'm going to set this let to be canvas props. And for our canvas props, I'm just going to set it to be an object. And I could literally, what I could do is just set my width to be that object. That's going to be that value. And for the height, I'm going to set this height. So I'm literally just creating an object that has a width and a height properties, and those are going to be my canvas properties. Now that I have canvas properties, I don't have to literally put them directly inside, but instead of that, I'll just put here 1, 2, 3, and I'm going to put here the canvas props, literally sending in the properties. Now, the beauty of this is that if the value is undefined, React is smart enough to basically react to it. So if I go ahead and save this and I look back into my application, first of all, if the values are there and we look into our inspector and we look to find our canvas element, we'll see that it has a height and it has a width. But if I go ahead and I change it, and let's say I don't send a height, I only send a width. Let me save this and let's see what happens. And we take a look, we'll see that now our canvas element will only have a width, but it won't have a height pre-configured. Although it will have a style that is configured from the library itself, making sure that there is at least some width, something going on there. But that's it. That is basically how you would create it in a way that would be completely dynamic, where you could control if you're putting a width and height, and you could even decide, for example, if there is no width, then let's say if there's a width, or we could put inside of here, literally we could put here a width, or we could put the value of 400. And in that situation, I could set here, and this is really if you want to make your app like really smart and really responsive, you could do that very easily. But there is also default properties that you could put in, which we'll talk about in a future lecture, where you could actually set default properties if the properties are not filled out. Although in our case, we kind of like the idea of if it's not set, then it's not set, which is fine. Maybe we don't want it set. And that's basically how you would configure and set up your chart. So we saw how to use one option, but there's more options, obviously. So we're going to explore more of them in the next lecture and get really familiar with the different options that are available to charts in general. In this lecture, we created a reusable component by extracting all the data out and using props instead. In the next lecture, we'll continue down our path as we explore some final options in Chart.js. As we mentioned a few times before, your goal when you're creating React components is to extract all the data from the component and send it in through properties, and only use state whenever it's a property that is intended to change in the life cycle of that component. So we're going to take a deeper look into this.props, and with that, lean all of our data on external sources and remove all the hard-coded data that needs to be updatable out of the component. By the process, we're creating a reusable component. Alright, let's continue visualizing our data, and we really have a good familiarity with our component. Although there's one thing we haven't really played with which is the options. So to do that, I'm going to go into my client, and I want to show you a few different options. You know what, even before that, for the type of data that we prepared using our A2 chart, we could use a bar chart, which is what we've been doing so far, but we could have also used, if we wanted to, a horizontal bar. And literally all we have to do now is just change it to horizontal bar. And if we go back into our code, we'll see that now our bars are horizontal. Moreover than that, we could also, let me just go ahead and just save this so you guys can look at it later. You could also place it to be a line. Now there's a lot of different types that you could put there, but the type depends on the data formats that are needed. So we're going to take a look at different types a little bit later, but I just want to show you that those three, so you have your three different types that you could use very, very easily. Now, I want to go back and let me just get rid of line and let's just put it back to our bar because it seemed the cleanest for our purposes right now. And I want to go into the options and show you what are options and how to work with them. So I'm not going to show you every single option. There is a lot of them, and you'll find in our documentation a link to a list of all the options that you could use. And I encourage you and implore you to just scan through them so you're familiar with the different options that you could control your React Chart.js application component that we've just created right now. Okay, so responsive, true. When responsive is true, what it actually means is the default, which basically means that it's going to try to get the component to be the largest that it can inside of the current bounds that is in. So for example, when we were talking previously in our chart and we've created these hard set values of 800 and 250 to our div, if I would get rid of those and I would just set it as a canvas without even setting a width or a height, what will happen, it would automatically try to capture as much of the screen as it can, basically taking over a really large portion, well, the whole screen. It's responsive. Now, what we did is we made it responsive, you could say, within the bounds of this box that we told it that it could live within. Now, this box is hard-coded, which really makes it not really responsive. But in reality, if we just set it this way, and let's say we didn't want it to be responsive, if I just go ahead and save this, I'm just going to go ahead and set here a width of 400, and I'm going to set a height of 400. So this is going to be my height and width of my canvas. Now, if I go into my application and take a look at it, it's actually going to ignore me completely. That is because we are responsive. And once I set responsive to be false, it will respect the size and bounds of the component size that it is when I set it in. So it's going to smash it in and set it to whatever size I set my component to be. And if that's the size that you want it and you want it hard set, then you could just go ahead and set the actual width and height of your canvas element in advance, and then go inside into your component and set it up thereafter. And by the way, one more thing that we could do here is also, if we wanted to set our chart, if we're really going to set this width and height, we could also set our width and height as a property and just set it to be 400, and we'll set our height to be 400. But if we do that, the one thing that we're going to have to do is when we go inside of our chart itself, one thing is, if you recall, we took out the type data and options. It doesn't really matter that there's more properties in there. It's not grabbing them. But inside of our canvas itself here, we could just go ahead and just set here a value. Instead of putting it to be hard coded, I could just say this dot props dot width. Let me just word wrap here so we could see better. And same applies. I could do just this dot height and just set here the height. And now if I go ahead and let me just put here a different value, and let's say we set the width of 800 and the height of 300, if we go ahead and save this and run it, it should pass through and react. So that way our component is going to be more dynamic, as it should be, because in the end of the day, we don't want to have here actually any size that is configured in advance. Now, one more thing that we could set if we wanted to, but we don't, is to put here maybe not to set a width if a value is not sent, and put here a little bit more extra logic that would define if it's there or not. But how about we do that? Because it would be a really great exercise to see how do you do things in JSX and how do you do things in ES6. So for this matter, let's say that there is a property of width and height. Maybe there isn't. And if there isn't, then we don't want to put anything. So in this case, what we'd want to do is we could set here basically a if. And in our if, and by the way, let me just set here a let, and I'm going to set this let to be canvas props. And for our canvas props, I'm just going to set it to be an object. And I could literally, what I could do is just set my width to be that object. That's going to be that value. And for the height, I'm going to set this height. So I'm literally just creating an object that has a width and a height properties, and those are going to be my canvas properties. Now that I have canvas properties, I don't have to literally put them directly inside, but instead of that, I'll just put here 1, 2, 3, and I'm going to put here the canvas props, literally sending in the properties. Now, the beauty of this is that if the value is undefined, React is smart enough to basically react to it. So if I go ahead and save this and I look back into my application, first of all, if the values are there and we look into our inspector and we look to find our canvas element, we'll see that it has a height and it has a width. But if I go ahead and I change it, and let's say I don't send a height, I only send a width. Let me save this and let's see what happens. And we take a look, we'll see that now our canvas element will only have a width, but it won't have a height pre-configured. Although it will have a style that is configured from the library itself, making sure that there is at least some width, something going on there. But that's it. That is basically how you would create it in a way that would be completely dynamic, where you could control if you're putting a width and height, and you could even decide, for example, if there is no width, then let's say if there's a width, or we could put inside of here, literally we could put here a width, or we could put the value of 400. And in that situation, I could set here, and this is really if you want to make your app like really smart and really responsive, you could do that very easily. But there is also default properties that you could put in, which we'll talk about in a future lecture, where you could actually set default properties if the properties are not filled out. Although in our case, we kind of like the idea of if it's not set, then it's not set, which is fine. Maybe we don't want it set. And that's basically how you would configure and set up your chart. So we saw how to use one option, but there's more options obviously. So we're going to explore more of them in the next lecture and get really familiar with the different options that are available to charts in general. In this lecture, we created a reusable component by extracting all the data out and using props instead. In the next lecture, we'll continue down our path as we explore some final options in Chart.js. We are done with the big topics of this section, and in the last lecture in this section, we're going to dedicate a little bit of time to get more familiar with Chart.js, more explicitly with its options, which we haven't really explored so far, and we're also going to test out our component. Okay, so let's continue. And really our main focus that we started talking about in the last lecture is the options. And I want to just show you a few options so you're familiar with the different things that you could do with it. So for example, we could have a title and we could literally just say we want to display a title, true. We want to have some text in it, people that are in charts. And that's all we had to do to add a title in, for example. And if we take a peek at it, we should now see our title. If we don't have an error here, let's see if we have an error here. It's refreshing people that are in charts. Beautiful. Let's continue. So, and by the way, there's a lot more than you could do with this. I'm just trying to show you different things that you could add inside, just like holistically, a few examples. Now, generally speaking, when you roll over something, you have a hover that shows you that specific thing. But if you want it not to show that specific thing, but to show a lot more than that, then you could just go ahead and say to your hover that when you're hovering, what do you want to do? You want to have a mode of, let's say, label. So you have your option of label or single. And if I set it to hover on label, you'll see that when we go on it, it's going to basically highlight. It's hard to see it, but it's highlighting all the three because of my screen and the colors that I picked. Beyond that, I could also control the tooltip. And the way I control the tooltip, I could say, okay, so in our tool tips, and I'm going to go ahead here and set my mode to be label as well instead of single. And what that will do again is once it's done re-rendering, is when we roll over an item, it's going to show us all the different items that relate to that label, which our label is Julie. So it's showing us that she's fun, smart, and witty, and all the properties related to her. And that might be a better solution for your needs of your application. Now, that is basically the basics of options, and there's quite a lot of different options that you could explore. I just wanted to say one thing that you could do is you could also add default options. For example, let's say we want our fonts to be really big. To do that, I'm going to go into my chart, and this is going to do it to any chart that we use. So really, this makes sense to put it maybe in a different place, but just for the sake of our example, I'll just type here just the name of the class, call the default property global dot whatever I want to define. And there's most of them. For example, default font size will just go ahead and I'll set my font to be 20. Now there's a lot of different defaults and you could go and check them out. In general, they correspond to the values that are within. So if it's font size, you would have default font size. Or if it's inside of a specific object, so if inside of hover, so you would go inside of global.hover and so forth. But look into the documentation of things that you want to create globally and you'll see the actual path. Now if we take a look, we'll see that our font is going to be a lot bigger. And that's it. Those are the basics of how you work with options and really the basics of now our component that we could share with the world and let other people use because our component now adds support to Create.js inside of our application, which is inside of React.js in general, which is awesome. And we are done with this chapter. In this lecture, we saw how to use the options of Chart.js. There's a lot more options and you're urged to explore them in the documentation provided with this chapter. With that said, we are done with this chapter and we're ready to move into our next and last section, which will be all about MongoDB. Welcome back to the last section in this title where we're going to move from JSON into MongoDB. In this section, we're going to explore the differences between MongoD and Mongo, which are both installed when you install the MongoDB client database. We're also going to learn some core terms in MongoDB, which are database, collection, and document. We're going to prepare data for MongoDB. We're going to set up also a server using Node.js, Express.js, and Mongo.js. And last but not least, we'll create a radar chart using all of these configurations that we prepare throughout this section. So with that said, let's start with the difference between MongoD and Mongo. When you install Mongo database, it installs also a driver, but you have the Mongo itself is just like a regular server, is a server for your database, which means that clients could interact with it and request things from it. To be able to interact with it, you need also to have a driver, and the built-in driver is called Mongo, and we're going to use both MongoD, and we have to have MongoD running to be able to use a driver to actually interact with it. So MongoD is the server, and Mongo, in our case, enables us to drive and interact with it. Now, last but not least, just as a side note, we're also going to use Mongo.js in this title, and that is going to be an unofficial driver for usage whenever you're in Node.js. With that said, I also want to say one more thing before you move into actually watching this lecture. Make sure that you install MongoD, your Mongo database. Links are provided with this chapter based on your operating system, so make sure that you have it installed before you move on to the actual lecture. And if you have it installed, let's jump right into it. As this title is all about data and different ways to visualize it, in this last section, we're going to be working with MongoDB. Now, we're not going to show you the process of installing it, nor are we going to go deep into the world of MongoDB and how it works. Before continuing into this lecture, make sure that you go into the added links that are provided to this chapter and go through the process of installing MongoDB if you're on Windows, OS X, or Linux. So by the end of this segment, which is really right now, before you continue to the video, make sure that you have MongoDB running. And how do you know if you have MongoDB running and installed? Go into your terminal, and in your terminal, I'm going to open up a few windows. In the first one, I'm just going to type here MongoD. And MongoD, what it's going to do is actually going to start up the MongoDB server. Don't worry about all the copy that's there. All that matters is you're seeing that you're waiting for connections in port 27017 or whatever port number you see on your end. Once MongoDB is set and running, open up another tab, and in this new tab, we're going to run a built-in MongoDB driver. Now, what is the difference between the MongoDB itself and a driver? The MongoDB itself is the actual database. It's a server, just like any other server. It's a database server that enables clients to communicate with it and gain access to that database's information. While a driver is a tool or a code that enables you to communicate with that database. Now, built into MongoDB, once you've installed MongoDB and you've typed MongoD to start up the server, if you type in Mongo, it will start up the Mongo shell. And this Mongo shell is the driver that enables you to communicate with your Mongo database. So in the next lecture, make sure that you have MongoDB running and that you're in the MongoDB driver. So you start up MongoDB with MongoD and you gain access to its driver or its shell through the command Mongo. So we'll see in the next lecture, we start looking at the basics of MongoDB itself. In this lecture, we saw how to start up our MongoD server and how to get into Mongo itself, the driver to interact with our server. In the next lecture, we'll continue and explore the three core terms in MongoDB. MongoDB, which is derived out of the NoSQL standard, has three main types of data that you should expect. The one is database. Now, if you work with databases before, you have the server and then you have a database itself for the project itself. So although it's a little bit DB database is a little bit confusing, but a database specifically is whenever you bundle up information per project, you want to put it inside of a database. On contrary, MongoDB is a server that could host many databases. Your collection is similar to tables if you know what they are from SQL, but if you don't, a collection is basically a collection of related items that you put together within a project. So you'll have more than one collection usually within one database. Last but not least is a document, which is comparable to a row in SQL if you've worked with SQL previously. If not, in our construct, a document is literally just an object that stores information that lives within a collection, and collections live within a database. Beyond that, that is really all you need to know from the core basic terms. With that said, let's see them in action. Let's see how you work with them in MongoDB. So I'm assuming at this stage that you have MongoDB installed and you have the MongoD server running and you're inside the Mongo shell. It doesn't really matter what the current version that you're in, although if you want to know what is the current version, by the way, if you want to know what the current version is, you could just type db version, open and close from inside there, and you'll see that I'm currently running on MongoDB version 3.26. Now, with that said, I want to show you the basics of MongoDB, and I'll give you also a side note that we are not going to go into every single detail in MongoDB, but I'm going to show you the basic foundations of it. And by the way, it doesn't really matter if you worked with a database before or not, really doesn't matter. So let's jump right into it. The first thing is databases, they store information that we provide them. In the case of MongoDB, it stores this information in JSON, basically in JavaScript. So it's very, very easy to work with if you know JavaScript. Now, generally speaking, a database or like MongoD has many databases. Now, the way you know what database you're in currently is just by typing DB. And when you type DB, it will output and tell you that you're currently in whatever database. Now, if you didn't set or configure a database, by default, it's going to go to the test database. Now, contrary to traditional database structures where you create a structure and you set it up in advance, with MongoDB and NoSQL in general, which is the name of the type of database that MongoDB implements, it's called NoSQL because there's no SQL in it. The way you change your database is by asking to use, and then you define the name of the database you want to work with. For example, I want to work with the new database. Now, automatically what happens is Mongo checks to see if new exists, and if it doesn't, it creates that database and switches into it. And now if I type DB, we'll see that I'm inside, not BD, but DB. We'll see that we're inside of new. Now, let me just double check if clear will clear things out. CLS, there we go. CLS will clear our screen. Okay, so now that we know how to use a specific DB, we saw what DB we're in, we saw that we could use different DBs by typing the word use or switching back into that new database. The next step, every single database in MongoDB and NoSQL holds collections. Now, you don't explicitly create collections, but instead of that, just like with actual creation of databases, you approach the database. In this case, our database is new, and in it I'm going to ask from DB, which is the name for it, dot the name of the collection I want to create. So in this case, let's say I want to create a chart collection, and this chart collection has been created, and I never create it explicitly, but instead of that I insert into it documents, which is the name of what we insert into them by typing the word insert. Now, what I put inside is objects. So for example, name Ben. Now notice how I'm literally just typing standard JavaScript objects. That is really what I put in, but to be very exact, we're putting in JSON. So technically speaking, I need to put here, obviously this has to open and close. Technically I should put here an open and close as well, but MongoDB is forgiving enough that if you send standard objects inside, it will process them and accept them. And in this case, I've just inserted a document. We call these objects documents inside of MongoDB. I've inserted a document into a collection inside of our database. So those are the three key terms that you need to know when you're working with NoSQL and specifically MongoDB. You need to be familiar with the database, the collection, and then the object. And that's exactly what we've done. Now, last but not least, by the way, if you want to fetch that information, one way to do that is we're going to go to that collection and we're going to find all of the items inside of that collection. And if I want to, I could also make it pretty by typing .pretty. And that's all I need to do, just a regular JavaScript line of code. And what will happen is going to output our object. And by the way, automatically when you place something inside, it will automatically add an underscore ID and give it a unique ID. So every item has a unique ID, so it's easily accessible and indexed. By the way, this is only true for the first level of an object. So for example, if I'm going to add here, by the way, if I add another Ben, it's not unique, right? So the way we make it unique is that MongoDB automatically assigns a unique ID to each one of these items. And now first Ben and second Ben are completely different objects. Moreover than that, I could add in more complex things such as, let's say, Ben and skills, and I could put here an array. The only thing that matters is that it's a legal, so a skill is JS and XML, let's say, and PHP, let's say, and as long as I put valid JSON, or more accurately valid objects, then it should come through. But if I put here something that's not valid, for example, this PHP is not closed, then I'm going to get an error. It's not going to actually complete. It's not going to understand what I actually wanted to do. So I have to make sure that I'm always typing in everything validly and everything correct. And there you go. And I've just added another item, another Ben. Now, those unique IDs that are placed are only placed on the root document. Excuse me for doing that. On the root document itself, it is not placed within child elements. So skills array doesn't get any object ID. So the object ID is only on items that are placed directly to live within a collection. So that's it. Those are the basics of MongoDB. In this lecture, we got familiar with the terms database, collection, and document. In the next lecture, we'll go ahead and prepare our data for MongoDB. Alright, so now that we know the basics of how to work with MongoDB, it's time for us to create our data set that we'll be sending into MongoDB. Once we have it ready, we'll insert that data into the database. We're going to insert, to be accurate, we're going to insert our document into a collection within a database, and then we're going to also fetch the ID of our data, so we'll be able to fetch it in the next lecture. So let's see how we set that up in this lecture. Okay, so we're familiar with MongoDB, and we've seen basically how to work with it. And before we continue onwards, the next thing I want to do is create the data source that we're going to be using inside of MongoDB. So to do that, I'm just going to go into any empty area in our editor. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create with you just a data object. And it's going to go this way. So our data object, and by the way, we're in the process of creating a more complex data structure. Now, our data structure is going to have basically a few labels, kind of similar to what we had previously. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and copy a pile of labels that I've pre-configured and pre-created, and I'm just going to walk you through them. I have math, English, Spanish, history, philosophy, sports, and science. Beautiful. Let's continue. So let me just also word wrap as I'm continuing. The next step is I need to set my data sets, and I'm going to have two data sets. Now, this time around, my data sets are going to be split among different people. So person number one will have one data set, person number two will have another data set. So our first person, we'll call him James, not Hames, not Hames, not Hames. Okay, I was stuck in a loop. Now, the next few things are really just about colors. So for example, I already pre-configured a few colors, so I'm just going to slap them right in there. So I'm setting here a background color with a 20% opacity. I'm setting also a border color. And by the way, I've kind of like grabbed these colors directly from the sample in React.js, just for the sake of keeping things simple. And I'm just going to go ahead and just copy all these colors. All this stuff is not mandatory. You could put whatever colors you want instead. But in this case, I'm just going to use some default colors that seem to be working well. Why be creative if you don't have to be in this site? Okay, so now that we have James, and let's set up his data points. So for his data, I'm literally just going to put in directly the content itself and just going to give the scores he got in the different, well, James is an incredibly smart student and all of his scores are 80 or above. So in math, he got 93. In English, he got 88. In Spanish, he got 93. In history, he got 99. Wow, that's impressive. Philosophy, he's a great philosopher. Sports, not the greatest sportsman, but yeah, let's give him a low sports. And for science, he is definitely into science. There he got 92. Beautiful. So that's our data source for James. Let me go ahead and just duplicate this, and we're going to create another data source for another person. How about we'll do this time around, let's set it to be Larry. And for Larry, let's go ahead and change a little bit the colors here. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab that color and just push it right there. And I'm just going to do the exact same thing over here. So we're going to get a different color construct. Oopsie. Let me just copy this whole thing. Paste that here. Paste that here. Paste that here. So it's all the same. Oh, do we want it to be the same color? Yeah, why not? Let's have it the same color. Okay, so that's basically our structure, and let me go ahead and I'm just going to move a few of the scores, but how about we'll make it a little bit worse. So he is not as good in some things, and 70, and let's give him just like 10 here, and maybe their scores are same in that one, but they're not in this one. Beautiful. So we have two data entries, and there we go. That's it. That is our data set. So the next step that we want to do is I'm going to go ahead, and what I want to do is I want to capture, and by the way, if this was a real data, we really don't need the variable name, because what I really want is to grab this object that we've just created, and I'm just going to cut it, and I'm going to go right into our MongoDB driver. And here I'm going to go ahead, first of all, I want to use a certain database. So let's give a name to the database that we want to use. So let's say we'll call this ChartsDB. That's going to be our database for charts. Now that we're in ChartsDB, I'm going to go to that DB, and I'm going to go to charts, and I'm going to input a new chart. So I'm going to insert a new chart. By literally what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste that full object, close a round bracket, hit enter. And what I've just done is I've just added that item CLS. I've just added that item into our charts. So let's go ahead and see it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click here, charts.find, and I'm just going to find it all. I don't even need to make it pretty. What I'm really interested in, you see this object ID element here? I'm just going to copy that and put it right into our server here. We're going to talk about the server in the next lecture, but I'm just going to paste it here and just keep that reference, copy it, because we're going to need it for the next lecture. In this lecture, we inputted our data into our database and got out of it an ID for our document, which we'll use once we move into creating our server, which we surprisingly are going to be doing in the next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to go ahead and create and set up Node.js with Express.js and MongoDB to create a server. Basically, Node.js is the server technology. Express.js is a library that helps facilitate easy interactions with Node.js as a server. And last but not least, MongoJS will enable us to communicate with our MongoDB that is running to fetch the information that we need. By the end of this lecture, you're going to know the basics of how to set up Node.js, Express.js, and MongoJS to work together. Okay, before we continue, as promised, let's talk about it. There are two folders for this section. There's the Mongo, the 005 Mongo, which is the continuation file from the last ending point in 004. And we have our server, which deliberately I separated them mainly for one purpose, and that is to try to make our code a little bit more simple and not involve too much backend code. So with that said, let's take a look at what's inside of our server. And by the way, just make sure that you type in npm install to install all the packages that are needed. And literally, when you look into the dependencies, you'll see all there is Express.js, it's called, and MongoJS, although it's called Express within npm. Express enables us to basically more simply create servers or interfaces for our server, while MongoJS enables us, it's not the official driver of MongoDB, but it's the easiest driver and the most fun one. It's very similar. It's just a really good driver that I use, and I encourage you to as well. Now, notice also that inside of our main script, this time around, there is a point or purpose to the fact that our main is called server.js, because that is our main file that we'll be working with. Contrary to before, where Webpack was really in charge, so it didn't really matter what we've put there. Okay, so let's go ahead and the first step, go inside of your server.js and add the Express file. Now, we're gonna require it. And I'm going to use, because we're not using Webpack and because we're not using Babel, we're not going to use any ES6 here. We're going to use standard JavaScript because that is what is currently supported in the point in time when I'm working in Node.js, because right now we're creating a Node.js application. The next thing that we want to load is the Mongo.js, and again, we're going to have a require, and we're going to ask for Mongo.js. So those are the two packages that we are basically going to be using. Now, Express itself, we need to start up, and to do that, I'm going to call create a new constant by literally just calling Express, opening and closing a bracket, starting up our Express application. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set up our database, or make a call to our database. So for our Mongo.js, what I want to do is I'm going to set here the name of the database. Now, the name of our database was ChartDB, I believe, but if we don't remember, we could go right back into our terminal and just go ahead and type DB to get the name of our DB. So you see we have your uppercase charts, not chart, and let me go ahead and put that in there. And the next property is going to be an array with a list of the different properties that we're expecting, or the different collections we expect to be working with. In this case, we're only expecting to work with charts, so I'm just going to list that out. And let me just comment this out for a second. I want to show you what every single Express app needs to have. To be able to start a server, all you really have to do is call the listen method into your app, which was created by Express, and set an IP. So in this case, I'm going to set the IP of 3001, and I'm going to go ahead and create here a function, and all this function is going to do is just create a console.log. We are running on port 3001. Okay, so we'll have a message coming back to us whenever we start our server, so we'll know that we're actually listening to that server. Okay, it's time for us to build out the logic that will actually render out our database item. Now, to do that, again, I'm going to go to my app and I'm going to set the path where you'll be able to gain access to our chart. And I'm going to set it at chart.json because it really is a JSON element. Now, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use the ES6. And by the way, I'm only doing this because I'm running in the really new modern version of Node.js. So if you're running on an older version, make sure to not use ES6. But if you're taking this course, then it's a good idea for you to download the latest version. And I'm going to use here an arrow function because I am actually with the latest version. And because I'm with the latest version, I'm completely fine because there is no transcribing being done on this JavaScript. So now that I have my callback added, or my arrow function that has a request and a response, it's time to me to actually approach my DB, and I'm going to go to my charts, and I'm going to find that item that we've just stored here under below. And now to get it, I'm going to send a request for the ID, and then just send in a Mongo.js dot and send in that object ID. That's all I had to do to request that specific item. And the next thing I'm going to do once I looked for a find is I want to send another error function here. And this time around, it's going to be or an error or a response. And I'm going to start putting the logic right inside of here of what happens whenever a response comes in. So if there is an error, I don't really want to do much. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to send a status basically saying 404, I can't find the page, but maybe you would want to create something a little bit more sophisticated. Okay, so the next thing, and I'm just going to go ahead and paste it, and I'm not going to dive too deep into it, but basically what this does, it allows us to control who gains access to our server and in what way. Now, because we're going to have our server acting in a separate place than our client, our server is going to be running in port 3001, but our client is going to run in 3000. They're actually communicating between two different servers. So these two lines will basically tell our server, allow anyone to gain access to your server. Not exactly the smartest thing to do in a production environment, but good enough for our testing purposes. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go and I'm going to send, using the response, I'm going to send back our object. And our object is going to be that in an array. So I'm going to take the first item there, but also I'm going to call the built-in JavaScript JSON and go ahead and stringify our value. Stringify? No, not stringify. So let's try this again. Stringify. There we go. So let's just walk through what we've just done. So basically we're listening to port 3001. Whenever the user tries to get something from chart.js, we're going to go ahead and search for the specific item that we want, which is the chart that we actually want. If the response we came back was not an error, we'll then allow access to anyone. And not only will we allow access to anyone, we're going to send out that information, making sure that whoever is going to load this up will be allowed to manipulate the data that they're fetching. So with that said, let's go ahead and save this and go back into our terminal, and let me search for a terminal for our server. Here we go. And this time around, instead of typing npm start, we're not going to do that. That's because npm start doesn't have any meaning anymore. But instead of that, I'm going to type here node space and the name of the file. In this case, I'm going to load up our server. So node space server. Now, if everything runs appropriately, we should see that we're running on port 3001. And now if we go into our browser and try to go to port 3001 and then try to get into our chart.js, was it chart.js? No, it wasn't. It was chart.json. And we should, voila, get our JSON data. So there we go. So we have our data object ready and prepared for us. In the next lecture, we're going to continue down this path. We're done with the server, but make sure that you keep your server running. Don't close it. Make sure that your node DB is still running. This area here, the driver for node DB is not important anymore. You could close it, but you do not want to close the MongoD server, nor do you want to close your actual server port 3001. And in the next lecture, we're going to move into the 005 Mongo finally and start connecting the dots, fetching that data into our charting component that we've already created and see what beautiful chart is created from it. In this lecture, we set up a server, a separate server that will mimic a real-world environment of a server, making it even better for our testing purposes. In the next lecture, we move back into the client as we create a radar chart and connect it to our data from our Mongo database. After all that hard work, we're ready to go back into the client and create a radar chart with MongoDB. This is our last lecture in this title, and to celebrate that, we'll use jQuery instead of using native JavaScript to create these interactions as a substitute method to getting your data. We're going to use JSON as always, and we're going to explore the radar chart. Our journey is almost complete, but it can't be without actually connecting everything together. Now, I'm taking our last chapter's client and just duplicating it, and we're going to continue and integrate MongoDB into it. With that said, our package JSON is the same, although we could probably delete the just random color because we're not using it, but I'm just going to leave everything there. The only thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my terminal because I want to do an npm install for jQuery, just to show you how to integrate jQuery as well. So let's go ahead and we'll install it, and as it's installing, let's go into our client. And let me show you how to set things up. So I'm just going to go ahead and first delete the things that are not relevant. We still need React. We still need React DOM. We still need our chart. What we do need also is we need to import also the jQuery from jQuery. So I'm just going to put it that dollar so that so recognizable $sign for jQuery. The next step, I'm just going to go ahead and do a get JSON, which I hope you're familiar with, which is, by the way, if you're not, just look back into chapter 2, I believe, where we did some JSON, and you could do it without jQuery if you choose to do so. Now, for our path, I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to copy the path of our chart and just literally just paste it right in there and create a callback function that accepts that JSON. And if I just go ahead and I do a console.log for our JSON, Let's go ahead and run our server and see if it actually works. So let me see if we're done. We're done. And let's go ahead here in O2. Let's go ahead and do an npm start up our server. Once our server starts running, we could go into our browser, open up a new port, local host, port 3000. Nope, we had a typo there, local host 3000. Beautiful. So we have we're definitely in the right place. If I just open up O2 inspect element and go into my console, we should, although our server is running very slowly, oddly enough, maybe it's something that we've done. Let's give it another reshot there to see if it's going to help. But it could be just something going on with my computer right now. So let's just continue with our work. Oh, and we got here. Okay, so A2C is not defined, which is very true because we don't have that anymore. But that's fine because we're about to delete it in a second. So let's continue down our work. So first of all, for our JSON itself, we could see the JSON object is coming back. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy all that logic here, all of this object, and I'm just going to move it into our callback. And once it's inside of our callback, let me just go ahead and take that JSON object and literally I'm just going to paste it into that area where we had that error because that doesn't exist anymore because we're not using it. And now that we have our data object, then how about let's go ahead and change our structure to be a radar instead. And once it's a radar, we have our data. I'm going to leave, looking at the... I don't really need all these options. So let me just go ahead and let's get rid of all the options. We don't need options. Let's just have an empty object there. Did I close it correctly? Let me see. Let me just put here null. Beautiful. Okay, so all that's left for us to do is actually to render, and I'm just going to go to my chart, cut it out there, and I'm going to render it only once the results come back. Our data is passing through, all the rest should be the same. And if I go ahead and save this and test it on my browser, hopefully if we don't have any errors, we should see now our two charts inside here, and we sure do. Very, 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 very cool stuff. And that's it. We are done with this title. In this lecture, we completed our title, and I want to congratulate you for that. We are done. I hope you had a really great time, and if you did, please do write a review and share this title with friends. And if you really, really enjoyed it, make a search for my name, Ben Falla, in the platform that you are in right now, which I'm sure you will find there are many other of my titles, which I'm sure will improve your skills, and you'll enjoy them if you've enjoyed this one. So with that said, if you want to contact me with any questions, suggestions for improvement, or even ideas of what titles should you take next, you're more than encouraged to send me an email. I check my email often, and I answer all of my emails at ben@0togeek.com, as it's on your screen. You can find me also on Twitter, but to be honest, I rarely ever go there, so I apologize if you send me a message because I really almost never go on. I'm not incredibly social in social media, but you're encouraged to email me, best way to reach me. And with that said, please write a review. Thank you so much for taking this title, and I hope to see you again in a future title together.